Welcome to this public hearing of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Richard Bury. I have the honor of chairing the commission. Since it's our first real hearing taking testimony, would love to just take a minute to introduce myself quickly. I am a Brooklyn native, so it's good to be in my home borough. I was raised in East New York, Brooklyn. My parents were immigrants from Panama. The son of a public school teacher. My mom taught public school at East New York High School for Transit Technology for almost 40 years before retiring, teaching Spanish and ESL. And I've been really lucky to spend my entire career here in New York, working on behalf of children and families. Started a mentoring program, was honored to lead the Children's Aid Society for several years. Served as a deputy mayor under Bill de Blasio, where I was able to lead initiatives such as the expansion of pre-K, and currently serve as CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, which is a foundation whose mission is to fight poverty in New York. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chair this commission because in so many ways, I think our task is so much aligned with my life's work of trying to make New York a better place for all. And of course, our timing couldn't be better given the significant challenges our city faces. But despite those challenges, I remain bullish on our capacity to do better and to do more. And even the energy in this room is a great reminder that we can accomplish big things together when we come together. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to lead our work, to think about how we can make sure that New York remains a center of opportunity that it was for my parents when they came here about 60 years ago. What does it mean to have a charter that promises a more inclusive city? Obviously, we're a city of multitudes. We have every political persuasion, 8 million people, double that many opinions. And that diversity can make things hard. It can make it hard to govern, hard to come together and find the path forward. And I think one of the challenges of this commission is to make sure that as we review the charter, that we are creating an opportunity to hear everyone's voices. Our charter work, of course, is ultimately about making a series of recommendations. Any recommendations that we make have to come to the voters for election. And I know that as a commission, we're really excited about making sure that we hear the broadest spectrum of voices so that when we make any recommendations, they're recommendations that really reflect the best judgment, the best idea that we've heard over the next few months. This is, of course, the first of many public hearings, and we're looking forward to hearing from experts, residents, community leaders, elected officials, and truly anyone who wishes to testify. And the last thing I will note is that although we were appointed by the mayor, this is very much an independent commission, which means that we are free to make our own judgments. In fact, we are required to and bound to make our own judgments and to pursue ideas regardless of where they came from or who supports them or who opposes them. Joining me in this task are 12 other commissioners, Vice Chair Sharon Greenberger, Secretary Leila Bozorg, Grace Bonilla, Shams DeBaron, who I'm not sure is here today, Anita Learmont, Dr. Lizette Nieves, Anthony Richardson, Julia Samuels, who I believe is joining us online, Diane Savino, Carl Weisbrod, Valerie White, and Catherine Weil. As I said, one of the tasks of the Charter Commission is to review the entire charter, but one of the things that we are planning to do is take a particularly close look at the charter's approach to housing and planning. Of course, there can be no more urgent challenge for us to take up. As we all know in this room, our city is in the midst of a profound affordability crisis. For millions of low-income New Yorkers, housing costs are the central struggle of their lives. And for millions more, especially low-income New Yorkers, our housing crisis severely limits where New Yorkers can live, what schools they can attend, how they can get to work, and whether their families can stay together. So I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that the future of housing is the future of New York City and really determines what kind of city we will be and for whom. I think our city has made significant strides recently under the leadership of our mayor and the city council and the tireless advocacy of countless advocates. Reforms such as the City of Yes for housing opportunity really do, I think, set the stage for good work, but all acknowledge there is far more work to be done. Today's hearing will focus on that topic in particular. And so let me take a minute to sort of describe how we're going to spend our time together. First, we've invited several panelists, each of whom is asked to testify for no longer than 5 minutes, followed by questions from the commissioners. Most are in the room, but some will be testifying virtually. We have the honor of starting the hearing with this testimony from a truly distinguished group of housing and land use experts. Vicky Bean, Barika Williams, Howard Slatkin, Vishan Chakrubati, and Jacob Anbinder. All of whom have served, many of them have served in city government and outside of city government on this issue, and bring a really impressive array of expertise about how our government works and how we make land use decisions. After that, we'll open the hearing to members of the public. I'm going to ask members of the public to testify for no longer than 3 minutes, and then members of the panel will have the opportunity to question any members of the public who testify. When we do the public testimony, we'll start from folks who are in the room in person, and then we'll go to those who are attending the meeting virtually. And for anyone who wishes to testify virtually, there is a form online. There is a page for this hearing. So if you can navigate to nyc.gov/charter, with nyc.gov/charter, click on the meetings tab and then select the Brooklyn hearing. We'll also drop a link in the chat of the Zoom meeting. We're going to do our best to hear from everyone. The meeting is scheduled to run until 8 p.m., so it's another reason to ask everyone to please be judicious if you're testifying, to make sure that everyone has a chance to participate. I'll ask both those testifying and commissioners to be mindful of the clock and their questions and in their testimony, just so that we can try to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. And for some reason, we don't get to everybody because we go too far past the time. Just remind everyone that it's possible to submit written testimony. Again, you can go to nyc.gov/charter, and you can also attend one of our other public hearings if for some reason we're not able to get to you today. And again, you can find information about all those hearings at that website. You can also submit testimony in writing at any time to the email address chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. That is chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. All the commissions are public. They're all live streamed and they are all recorded. If you want to review one of the hearings at another time. So before we begin, I'd like to ask for a motion from the commission to approve the minutes from our January 7th hearing. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Can I have a second? Any questions or discussion about the minutes? All in favor, please say aye. Any opposed or abstentions? All right, the minutes are adopted. So with that, we'll go to our testimony. First, looking forward to hearing from Professor Vicky Bean of NYU Law School.
Let me get all mic'd up here. Thank you very much to all the members of the commission for convening this hearing, and very much for your public service. To have a group of people with so much expertise and creativity and raw smarts working on this is really a benefit to the city as a whole, and we are very grateful. Over many decades, as you know, and as Chair Bury alluded to, New York City has invested enormous amounts of resources, both money, federal, state, local money, and time and talent of city officials to make the city's housing stock both more affordable and high quality. Yet the housing affordability problem has really reached crisis proportions, and there are a number of red flags. More people are leaving the city than are coming in. Nope. There we go. Okay. This is a slide that shows that we have between April 2020 and July of 2023, the city's population declined by more than 550,000 residents, or more than 6% of the city's population. That is one of the largest sustained population declines in recent history, and it's largely due to declines in net domestic migration. More people are leaving the city for other parts of the country than are coming here from other parts of the country. The pandemic exacerbated that trend, to be sure, but as you can see there, it was well underway by 2011. One of the major reasons that people say that they are leaving is the cost of living. The share of the city's renters who are paying more than 30% of their income for housing expenses has hovered stubbornly at around 50% for decades, and more than 27% of our families, mostly the lowest income households in the city, pay more than half of their income for housing. One of the primary reasons for the high cost of housing is the low rate of residential construction in the city. A great deal of research shows that with more supply, you get lower prices, lower rents, or lower rent growth. Nevertheless, the city built less than what it needed in the 1980s and 1990s and has never really recovered from that deficit. The city's land use system is one reason for the inadequate production. While we have the best and the brightest at our different agencies, we also have a land use system that makes building housing extraordinarily risky, costly, and time-consuming. We say that a great deal is as of right, but the truth is that a great many that we are permitting at way lower rates than our competitor cities around the United States. And about a third of all the units that were permitted in between 2010 and 2023 were actually on land that had been rezoned recently. The very uncomfortable fact about all this is that some neighborhoods really shirk their obligation to provide housing growth. Just 10 of the city's 59 community districts, with only 13% of the population, housed 48% of the new housing growth over the last, from 2010 to 2023. And half of the community districts in the city, with 57% of the population, added only 21% of the housing stock growth. So the disparity in which neighborhoods contribute to alleviating the housing shortage and which do not is unfair, and it makes every neighborhood less willing to allow for necessary growth. I think that one of the key things that the Commission really has to focus on is every step in the development process and the risks that are posed and the delay and the cost that come with that risk. I've outlined in my written testimony the phases of development, the key milestones of each, and the risks that each pose. But I want to draw some bigger picture lessons. First of all, the process is just too long. A recent study by the Federal Reserve Board indicated that across the nation, it takes about 15 months from the announcement of a project to being shovels in the ground. The time in New York is 2.5 to 4 times that. The time required imposes enormous cost, carrying the land, the option for the land, hiring all the staff can add millions of dollars. It's too risky. People have to put too much money on the table before the elected officials ever have to commit or give input. And those elected officials are not giving sufficient attention to citywide needs. They pay too little attention in the process to the needs of the city as a whole, and that results in individual council members being able to veto or deter housing, even though that would be in the interest of the city as a whole. As I said, some neighborhoods shirk, and some of the tools along the way are misused. Environmental review, other kinds of reviews add enormous litigation risk, enormous time and delay to the process, and don't really address the kinds of environmental concerns that we're talking about. So I want to end there by saying I think it's really important for the Commission to think about all of these different risks, to evaluate the efficiency of those risks and the time and the delay that they impose. And I wish you good luck. We stand ready to help in whatever way we can. And thank you again for your service.
Thank you, Professor. Any questions from the commissioners? Please.
Thanks,
Lena?
Professor Bean. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about some of your experiences when you were overseeing HPD and as deputy mayor in the effort to try to build more housing across the city. I mean, you named some of those barriers, but specifically, you know, in given that New York City puts so many resources towards affordable housing production, this balance between how we do affordable, how we unlock even market rate housing, just some of the not just what the research shows, but what you experienced firsthand too in trying to build in more neighborhoods.
Okay, I think we are fortunate to be able to devote the kinds of resources that we've devoted over the last few decades. I don't know that that will continue in the new era. But the truth is that we add so much cost through so many delays, right? And it's delays, not just the ones that I've talked about in sort of the ULURP and the pre-ULURP process, but once you get through that process and you still haven't gotten a commitment from your council member, from the council, as you know, you then have to deal with the fact that your proposal, which was 3 years ago, may no longer pencil. You've got to update the financing. You've got new term sheets in the agencies. All of those things make you almost have to start all over again, and that's delay and risk and litigation risk, right? And I do want to say, I mean, we have so many incredible elected officials who are serving the city in such amazing ways. Nevertheless, sometimes you get a situation where a council member just digs in and you end up spending months, if not years, negotiating over, you know, can there be any homeless set-asides in the housing? Can there, you know, what are the AMI levels? And those are legitimate conversations to have, but not when it's adding a year, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars per unit to the housing.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
It's been a while. So I want to take you back to an experience that we shared together when we went through the rezoning of Coney Island.
Mhm.
So we not only had 30 blocks of area that had not seen development in decades, but we had a willing council member.
Mhm.
So knowing then, right, we had a willing council member, so we didn't have to worry about member deference denying the changes. It still took forever. And in fact, some of the projects that we cited back then, going back to 2009, are still not yet in the ground.
Yeah.
So it's not simply just the council process. What could we do differently to speed up that type of activity? I think you, in your comments, you said on average in most states, it takes 15 months from conception to shovels in the ground, and we're looking at more like 4,500. What could we do before it ever gets to the council members, you know, oversight to speed up that process?
So I think if we're recalling the same set of facts, and thank you for your service, one of the issues there was coordination between the agencies, right? We had a park issue, we had a building issue that needed to be changed. All of that took an enormous amount of time. It would be great if we had essentially limits on those kinds of conversations, even when some of those buildings that have been developed there then face months and months and months of delay with, you know, building inspections, with fire department inspections, with all kinds of inspections. They're that's housing, sitting empty while we have families in shelter that could be put to use. And there's no, I mean, every agency faces issues about priorities, issues about staffing, but there really needs to be a push to set deadlines on those kinds of coordination problems.
It's almost as if we need a progressive design build for the development of housing.
That is what we're seeing a lot of success in public housing in those ways. And it is, we do need deadlines and we do need upfront decision-making and coordination.
Thank you.
Sharon?
Thank you again. I just have a quick question. You mentioned that 1/3 of housing production is done through rezonings. Does that imply that 2/3 is done through as of right? Is that,
Well,
what's that? math?
Not exactly, Sharon. I appreciate the question because what we looked at is a particular slice of time, but many of the things that are being built even in the 2000s might have been rezoned in 1980, or the Coney Island example, right? 15 years may go by before you see something actually happen. It's attributable to that rezoning, but we only looked at it, it's,
Yeah. Is
That's
there a
life
way
in
to
time.
determine if you looked on an annual basis, how much would be as of right versus, or is that just too difficult?
you'd have to go
for the time
back
span?
decades and decades to see what had been rezoned and make sure that you're finished, with what's being produced from that rezoning. I mean, if you think about still the amount of development that we're seeing on the Greenpoint Williamsburg waterfront resulting from, I don't know what, that was 2005, 2007, right?
Right.
So it does take a long time, but all of that is attributable back to that rezoning, right?
You talked about the differential burdens or different neighborhoods taking on different parts of the city's housing burden.
Mhm.
Can you elaborate more on that dynamic and if you could, what are some of the driving factors that lead to different communities taking on more or less responsibility for the city's housing needs?
So the neighborhoods that have traditionally provided less housing growth are often the low-density neighborhoods. Those low-density neighborhoods complain that they don't have the schools, the transportation infrastructure, sometimes the sewage infrastructure to do that. So again, it requires enormous coordination to bring that all online and get that in place. But in many cases, I mean, remember that in the early 2000s, there was a lot of downzoning in those neighborhoods. And so they're just not zoned to allow more development. And trying to get a rezoning through to up that, as the latest round on City of Yes showed, is extraordinarily difficult, right? So all of that comes into play. And there's just, many of those neighborhoods have higher rates of home ownership than some of the other neighborhoods. And the homeowners are particularly concerned about their housing values, those kinds of issues. And so it is a complex problem, but it is a major source of unfairness.
Thank you. It's time for one more question. Carl?
I want to just explore for a minute the correlation, if there is one, between time and subsidy.
Mhm.
And as you and others have said, time is money, and the more time it takes to get projects approved, the more expensive it will be. But how does that, if it does at all, affect the pot of money potentially that the city has to support affordable housing, especially given, as you noted, the likelihood that that pot may well shrink going forward?
So the worry is that the longer time goes by, the more risks like increased interest rates, et cetera, can raise the price of developing, right? And so that will require more subsidy or, something has to fill that gap. And it's not just the sort of market changes like for interest rate changes, but, I don't know what it is now, but when I left city government, we had a pipeline of about 6 years. And so you could get all the way through ULURP and then wait for 6 years for subsidy to be freed up of the available pot, right, to fund that project. In those 6 years, plus the time that was taken for ULURP, interest rates may have gone up, the term sheets may have changed, regulations may have changed to make building more costly. So the more time goes by, the higher the cost per unit is going to be. So you're either going to be able to fund fewer units or you're going to need more money.
And just to be clear, that principally would affect affordable housing, would think.
It will the housing subsidies will certainly be affecting affordable housing, income restricted housing, right? But it's driving up the cost of even the market rate housing as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it, Professor. Next, I'd like to invite Barika Williams, the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. Welcome.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. That's my clock.
Good
Okay.
evening.
Thank you, Chair Bury, and thank you, Commissioners, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, or ANHD, and we're a 50-year-old nonprofit here in New York City, working with many of the groups who are responsible for nonprofit groups who are responsible for building and managing these affordable housing units across the city, but also supportive housing providers, community organizers, economic development advocates, and direct service providers as well. Our mission is to build community power to win affordable housing and thriving, equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. This is near and dear to our heart. So we are also a member of the Thriving and convener of the Thriving Communities Coalition, TCC, which is a citywide movement of grassroots organizing, advocacy, and policy organizations working specifically on something we have called comprehensive planning for a long period of time. What we're focused on is changing the framework of how we think about planning, development, and investment here in New York City. Instead of an ad hoc approach to planning that we've been using for years, that we know doesn't effectively deliver for many New Yorkers and most New Yorkers, but also reinforces our long inequitable practices, as Vicki talked about, and I will speak a little bit more about. Specifically, what we're talking about for comprehensive planning is something that aligns and coordinates existing plans, sets clear goals across the city, centers racial, economic, health, and climate equity, and is intentional, robust, and representative, including of community engagement. Already has come up other issues. So this isn't just a housing issue. It intersects with education. It intersects with transit. It intersects with healthcare. And so recognizing that all of these things need to be integrated when we're planning for our city and planning for our neighborhoods. So moving to a proactive approach, we would love to talk with and for the commission to consider advancing comprehensive planning, specifically amending the charter to mandate that New York City create a comprehensive plan that uses equity goals to establish clear, equitable targets and empowers communities to then create local plans that feed into those targets. So this is now, we're starting with citywide equity goals, which we already have in the City Council's Fair Housing Plan to a certain extent, but that's only housing. Then creating a comprehensive planning steering committee that then oversees the process of understanding how this then plays out across neighborhoods, that says, here's our various different citywide targets for these a variety of topics and issues. And then from that, the community district levels set targets that then have to feed into these citywide targets. That way, we are not in a situation where a community district is advancing its goals that are not in alignment with what we need overall as a city. It would commit all 59 community districts to creating these plans, but then also ensure and require that our budgets for land use, expense budgets, and capital budgets all to have to reinforce what is being put forward in the plan. We are very conscious, very aware that we can't just say communities have to plan this and magically do this, nor can we say our agencies have to magically be able to execute on this. We know that one of the challenges, I don't want to repeat too much what Vicki said, but for example, 10 of New York City's 59 community boards have built more than the other 49 combined, right? So for example, Bronx CD1 with almost 11,000 units in comparison to Manhattan CD8, which is less than 1,000, right? So this is the delta that we're looking at. And we see the same thing show up in non-housing issues. So Manhattan Community District 2, West Village, Soho, where 100% of the residents are within walking distance of a park or open space, in comparison to Queens Community District 13 out by the Nassau border, where only 38% are in walking distance. So across all of those. As a part of some of the ways to mechanize this, we would talk about fast tracking 100% affordable housing projects to move through some of these pipelines more quickly, hopefully reduce some of their cost and expenditures, making the existing fair housing plan that is in section 16A for the city council enforceable and have teeth. Right now it's a planning mechanism, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. And then also exploring how we then feed in this to our capital dollars and to dollars committed. We're very aware, we have been doing this for a long time, that we don't want to lock in agencies into too much of a structure that they're not able to respond to active projects, changing priorities on the ground, but also we don't want to create a framework that then agencies or administrations can ignore. I want to conclude by thanking you all for your service and your time, and asking this commission to take bold, systemic steps that begin to move New York City away from our current land use and planning and zoning frameworks and really to something that benefits all New Yorkers, recognizing that the honest truth is our current systems and what we've been using for a long time have been benefiting some, but not all.
Thank you so much. Questions, Anita?
Thank you very much for your testimony. A question I have in terms of, you know, developing your capital planning framework, what have you thought about in terms of the enforceability of such a plan and accountability in terms of, you know, you'll have community districts with targets, but to ensure that those targets are met, because otherwise, you know, I think there's a challenge that we've always sort of considered in this. How would you deal with that?
Yes. We've talked about it in two different ways where, there's the way that the federal government prior to maybe more recently was administering this in AFFH, which was an affirmatively furthering fair housing, which would be the loss of federal investments. So there's like a penalty framework of this where you would say you're potentially losing funds or investments. And I think in order for that to be effective, it would have to probably be it would have to be broadly a penalty across, not just specific to housing investments, because to be honest, some of these communities would be quite happy being able to say, we didn't take the housing investment and so therefore don't have to build the housing. So the penalty has to be felt on something that actually impacts those communities and brings them in, but then also could be an incentive opportunity to say, when you do this, I think there's an opportunity, and that's why balancing out with not just housing creates the circumstance where you can say, you're literally looking for new school seats in your community. We're going to be able to support new school seats, but we can only do that if you're also funding affordable housing.
Thank you. Was that?
Hi, thanks for your testimony. I'm curious if there's an example that you could refer to as a model that we can learn from where we've really seen this kind of community district and community boards planning their budgets and having it reinforced that we could say, yeah, a little bit more of that.
Yes, I can get back to you with specific places. A number of other major metropolitan areas across the country actually have some form of comprehensive planning. In fact, it's not apples to oranges, but for example, our neighbors just on the other side of the river in New Jersey have a version where you are required to fulfill your fair housing numbers and targets and is mandated. Likewise, there's a somewhat similar framework in Maryland. So we know that there are examples. New York's complicated, so it's a little different to take somebody else's exact example and drop it here, right? Not everybody has our community district framework that's optional. So yeah.
And for me, it's even not so much the example. I mean, I do know of other states that are doing some interesting things. The question is in process.
In
because
process,
so much
yeah.
of your recommendations about process,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Are there other processes even outside of housing that you see could map on
Okay.
to this that offers the accountability and other pieces that we think are important, particularly, like I said, the reinforcing the planning and supporting of community boards in that planning?
Absolutely. We'll get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Savino?
No, Valerie was first.
Oh, sure. Commissioner White?
Hello, Barika.
Hello.
Good to see you. Thank you for your testimony. Just to sort of piggyback on some of these comments, when you think about a comprehensive planning strategy, what are some of the other parts of the ecosystem? You mentioned schooling that could tie into a larger community planning that would support additional housing units, but also building up the community with the type of ancillary services they need to be successful.
So I think a great example of where we maybe couldn't quite figure this out successfully is what transpired in the Flushing neighborhood rezoning, where there was a plan to increase density in Flushing, increase affordable housing, but to do that much housing unilaterally without being able to address the fact that you were at an already overcapacity transit system just was not going to add up. And ultimately, part of the reason, it's not the only reason, but a significant reason that that rezoning did not go forward was because there was no real pathway to addressing the fact that there wasn't a way to add capacity to the 7 line and to the buses out there, right? And you know, I think we've got to be reasonable and when saying to folks, add all these new units, that they add a lot of kids, they add a lot of people commuting, they add more folks in beds at your local hospitals, and so you can't just ask for one, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Both you and Vicky Bean talked about the challenges of developing housing in the city of New York and the bureaucracy and all of the issues that get in the way from financing to the calendar, et cetera. But you said something specifically in your testimony that you're requesting that we amend the city charter to add a comprehensive plan. So can you talk more about how that would change? And are we suggesting creating a new entity under the charter that would be responsible for the comprehensive plan or assigning specific duties to like the city planning or HPD? What did you mean by that?
I think we would talk with you all and want to talk with the agencies. There's a version of this that could be vested in city planning, but it cannot be the purview and responsibility of city planning alone. It's too broad for it to just sit with them, which is also why we proposed a steering committee that then would work across different issue areas to help set those targets and goals. But yes, it would be similar to saying, right now we have other required plans and metrics that the city has to look to in the charter and fulfill every year. I think currently the new fair housing plan that was passed by the city council is every 5 years, I believe, on a rolling basis. So the framework for requiring the plan is there, but we're talking about expanding it beyond a plan on paper to something that is actionable and enforceable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll give you the last question.
Thanks, Brika, for your testimony. I'm curious, you all have been thinking about comprehensive planning for a long time, and I'm intrigued by this fast track idea, which seems to suggest you kind of have to do, if you were to do comprehensive planning, we also have to consider other reforms so that we don't end up in a state of like planning paralysis, especially if we do comprehensive planning. There's an assumption there that we can get every community board to agree to targets and put that on paper and have the plan voted on. So how do you balance the need for action, the fact that today we're in a worse position than we were 10 years ago on housing, with the length of time that this type of comprehensive plan and the types of coordination that's needed? How do you ensure there's also action stemming from that?
Yes. So we will say we go through a lot of these ULURPs with city agencies. We have done a number of these neighborhood rezonings, and our members develop these housing units. It takes a lot. It's so difficult to sit in front of a community board and explain to folks that the housing that they're talking about, they won't see for 10 years. And I think it's incredibly big challenge. But I would challenge you all and encourage you all to think about both sides of what you're talking about, Layla, of the action piece and the long-term process and planning piece. I think we've been leaning more on the expediency side, but not always getting to the results that we want, right? It's for any of us that are working on the affordable housing and ULURP side, it's whack-a-mole. It's one by one, project by project. We only have and can only influence whatever projects are coming before us, right? There's no way right now for a community to say, my priority is senior housing, affordable home ownership, and large family size units, and this is what we need to focus on in this neighborhood. They can't structurally, they can't do it. So yes, the fast track piece is to make sure that we're not halting, that what we're not doing in the process of this is saying, we're gonna stop everything and not develop anything. And so projects continue to move through the pipeline. But the other piece, which I think our affordable housing community would welcome, but and the supportive housing community welcome, but I would also say I think the broader, including market rate development community would welcome is some clarity and predictability around what people are looking to be developed and created in communities. It is hard for any and all of us to start a project at year 1 and year 5 when it's finally, or year 3 when it's finally going through ULURP, find out that the political priorities, the community priorities have changed, and so potentially your project is now being turned down. And that is exacerbated by the fact that Vicki talked about this, but we didn't specifically say this. In the course of all of that time, your AMIs are going up, right? So the project gets greenlighted in year 1, but by the time we're actually opening these units, electeds are saying, we thought this was an $1,800 2-bedroom apartment, and now it's 25, 26, right? So how do we both trim that, give some clarity and predictability, and and recognize that we've got to invest some time in like the long scale process of this while also continuing to move forward day to day.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rika. Next, we'll hear from Howard Slatkin of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Bury and Commissioners. I will associate myself with Professor Bean's gratitude for your service. My name is Howard Slatkin. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, an 87-year-old policy research organization. I'm pleased to be with you to share lessons from CHBC's recent research on the ULURP process, as well as from my own experience in more than 2 decades with the Department of City Planning. With my testimony, I'll be submitting a report that CHBC released today on the subject of ULURP, housing, and charter reform. I'm going to focus tonight on 3 topics: the political incentives that are embedded in the ULURP process as it's currently structured, how the 1989 charter revisions got us here, some of the history behind it, and finally, some principles that I suggest to guide reform. There are many strengths to the ULURP process. I won't detail them here in the interest of time, but the process also contains built-in political incentives that are skewed ultimately against housing. The problem is rooted in 2 intertwined factors: NIMBYism and member deference. We need to understand these not as irrational behaviors or personal failings that can be resolved through individual effort, but rather as rational, systemic phenomena that we need to account for when we design our decision processes. I don't need to explain to people what NIMBYism is. It is natural that NIMBYism is louder than the voice of people who are in need of housing in a local action. The future occupants of new apartment buildings and the millions of people who benefit a little bit from the addition of housing don't show up to public hearings. This quiet majority is represented in the process by officials who have a broader geographic purview. The practice of member deference is essentially an unwritten agreement that enables each council member to effectively wield the authority of the full council regarding matters in their own district. There is an internal logic to it as a practice among legislators, but it introduces systemic bias against new housing and the equitable distribution of housing. Under this system, local elected officials who oppose new housing have the power to bar the door. And electeds who might actually favor new housing are consigned to a Thunderdome-style battle with project opponents where they face harsh political penalties if they dare advocate for citywide needs. Simply put, the system is skewed to make it too difficult to say yes and too easy to say no, or often not now. Proposals are cut back, delayed, or often not introduced at all because the local members made it clear that this would be a futile investment of time and resources. The key question is not whether residents or council members are behaving rationally, but whether our decision process is designed rationally. The ULURP process actually wasn't designed with this in mind. It was created in 1975 to replace the top-down master planning model of the 1936 charter. It had the idea of local voice, citywide responsibility. Locals get the first say in the process, but the decision authority rests with officials who have citywide or borough-wide purview. In 1989, when the City Council replaced the Board of Estimate, effectively the introduction of member deference broke this concept because the final vote in the process is effectively delegated to the only elected official who could potentially be fired by local project opponents. Instead of contextualizing local perspectives through a citywide lens, the process elevates localism above citywide interests. It's important to note that land use is the only arena where the council votes on actions of a strictly local nature. CHPC analyzed data on ULURP actions approved since the dawn of ULURP, and there have been fewer rezonings since the 1989 charter revisions, and the neighborhoods that have resisted rezoning through this process have actually added less housing in recent decades. A couple of additional reasons that it's apt for this commission to look and re-examine the 89 changes. One, our housing shortage is much more severe. I won't go into detail on that, but that is a dramatic difference between now and the 1980s. And second, demographic changes. The 1989 revisions were animated by the imperative of improving representation for communities of color in a majority white city. Today, however, the demographics of the city's population and elected representation have changed dramatically. And the minority communities protected by member deference today are often whiter, more affluent homeowner communities. Would offer a few principles for charter revision to recommendations. I'll just cite them here. One, return to the original concept from 1975 of local voice, citywide responsibility. Find ways to build a check against member deference into the process. Find ways to promote cooperation within the ULURP process rather than a structure that stokes conflict or rivalry. Find ways to make minor actions faster and less resource intensive, and accelerate urgent affordable housing investments with procedural relief for things like the disposition of city-owned land for affordable housing and NYCHA campus investments made through the resident partnership model. I'll be happy to answer any questions that the commission may have.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start with a question. You ended by talking about the need to balance local input in a citywide perspective. Can you say a little bit more about how you might operationalize that?
Yes. And I think that I've refrained in this report, we've refrained from putting a lot of specific detail into it, but the process that was created in 1989 had a potential check on this process of member deference built into it. The idea is that the mayor can veto a council action. Ultimately, there are many things, there are a number of things like the triple no and other things that were built into the ULURP process in 1989 that ultimately didn't play out the way that the Charter Revision Commission thought. For instance, optional call-up of land use items. The city council calls up everything that has optional call-up. The idea was that the council wasn't going to review every local action. They would only review the big controversial ones, but in essence, they review every action. The mayoral veto has proven ineffective for a couple of reasons. One, the council can override it just as easily as they can defer to the local member on the original decision. And second, a kind of flat up or down veto is a very blunt instrument for improving the project at the last stage of the process. It's kind of like an emergency escape hatch of some. It's not a really effective way of fine-tuning the approval process. So I think that the critical thing is finding ways that officials with a broader purview, whether it's the borough presidents, whether it's the planning commission, which has representatives of the mayor, the borough presidents, and other citywide officials, finding ways for them to enhance that role in the later stages of the process, and look for ways that the council and the commission can make decisions that aren't necessarily in competition with one another.
Thank you. Any questions from the commissioners? Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I see we've been joined by the Brooklyn Borough President, and that made me reflect on the fact that I may be on this panel the only person who's ever served as an elected official, though in the state Senate, but he served in local government as well. And I know there's a lot of discussion around the issue of member deference. And I think you said it perfectly. They are the one person in this chain that has to worry about getting fired for a decision that's made, even when it may be the right decision for that community or for the development of housing and for the future of the district. But they live in short spurts, right? 4 years at a time, sometimes it's 2 years at a time. But they are also the person that community, that district elected to protect the neighborhood around them, and however they think that means. whether it's the development of housing or or stopping housing, and the most important thing is people don't like change in their neighborhood. They like to say, this is the store I shopped in when I was 6, and it's still there on the corner. And of course, that's not reality. You can't develop a city that way, and you can't plan for housing that way either. But that one person, that member, has to answer to the 160,000 people in their council district, or a congressional member, and everyone is drawn into it. So you said something interesting about maybe broadening the decision-making from just a single member or that council member to maybe include the borough president and or others. But wouldn't they more likely reflect each other's opinion and come to the same conclusion about that development? And I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Understood. And I think, I'd really like to come back in the future to the commission with some more specific recommendations about mechanisms that you could use to achieve this. But I think that an important thing about looking at this process and the way you're describing it too is that there are not like good guys and bad guys in this process. Everyone has a job, and they have the responsibility to discharge the job that they were elected to, to do, they have to discharge that responsibility, but so does everyone else. And the problem that emerges is that not only is that member responsible for advocating for what they're hearing from their constituents, they're also made responsible for advocating for what's best for the entire city, because no one else steps into that process to do that. The idea is that the city council is a body of citywide, that they act in all other respects as a body, deliberative body where members come together, debate, and then they vote on actions that are not strictly local. In this case, everyone else leaves the room. Like literally, this is what happens in the hearings. Everyone else leaves the room, and the local member is left there with all of this weight on their shoulders. And whether they, like, as you said, whether they don't want to see new housing or whether they do want to see new housing, they're being asked to do a job that isn't really the job they were elected to do. They're there to advocate for their constituents, and there are 50 other members who are there to advocate for the other things that are in the interest of the city. But that part of the process just doesn't work on local actions, and so that's why we need to find these fixes.
Would turn the clock back to 1975.
I mean, one of the things that I don't want to suggest is restoring the Board of Estimate. That is not the proposal here. But the concept, which is that at the end of the day, the decisions, another thing about, when I was talking about NIMBYism, I think everyone, if you ask them their opinion about what should happen right around their home, maybe there are some people who are better than me or other people that, we all have that same perspective. It's important to not give us that decision. That's not our decision. That's a decision that our views should be heard and integrated with an understanding of what's best on the whole. And that is a difficult process. That is what the process is all about. It's about striking that balance and reconciling those two things. So I'll have some more specific ideas.
Thank you. I want to note before we continue questioning that we were joined not only by Borough President Antonio Reynoso, who will have to join us in a few moments, but also by Commissioner Shams DeBaron, who's joined us. Any other questions from the commissioners?
Howard, in thinking about this, I think it would be helpful to the commission if there were examples of jurisdictions that have changed or deviated from the original paradigm that is similar to ours for us to think about, because I know it's a really challenging thing to think about how we would change this. So do you have any examples, or could you, share some with us as we move forward?
I'll try to share some examples. I think there are a lot of examples from the history of the city, and interestingly, many of them have been discarded. Things like at-large council members, right? This is something that existed prior to the 1980s. I think with 84, I think the last at-large members were eliminated. But I think one of the ideas is that, yes, we'll come back with some more models for you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Save everyone's time.
One more question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Howard, your experience doing strategic planning for DCP, I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit on like some of the charter provisions that already require fair share of certain public facilities. Are there lessons from that we can bring into housing or limitations? And then similarly, and I think it's related, just given your experience doing strategic planning, how do you balance, these calls for comprehensive planning with some of the needs to make reforms in the process to move towards action?
Right. I think there are different versions of kind of plan consistency, whether it's a sort of a fair share kind of model or a housing targets model or a comprehensive plan model. The models that I'm familiar with usually rely on a higher level of government that mandates compliance, and there's someone external to the city government who holds the city responsible for consistency, because consistency is in the eye of the beholder often. Maybe not with a numerical target, that might be a little bit easier, but that can be difficult among co-equal branches of government to sort of spar over what is consistent with a plan or policy. That said, there are lots of ways to provide the context for decision-making. And I think the essence of ULURP is transparency and disclosure, and with context, right? That there are goals, there are targets, there are public policies that are trying to be advanced. That gives the public, that gives all the participants in the process something against which to hold any land use proposal and to ask, does it meet these things? It's really hard to arrive at objective, clear, black and white answers as to whether something is consistent. But the purpose of ULURP is not to, sort of check a box and say, this is good, this is not, this complies, this doesn't. It's a debate. It's a public deliberation. And that plan and those plans provide the backdrop for making those decisions. I think that's an important part of the process.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. One last question, Commissioner DeBarron.
So I got here a little late, so I might have missed a lot. And so if I'm asking something that's already been said, pardon me. So I want to ask you, just for my own understanding, for you, what is an ideal ULURP process? And what are some suggestions that you have if this hasn't been said, or, pardon me if it's already been said? What are some of the suggestions that you would have to make that ULURP process work better and more efficient?
I'll try. That could be like I could give a very long answer, but I won't. And I'll try to come back with some more specific recommendations, but I think I'll try to answer it again on the level of principles. I think the idea of the ULURP process is that the first step in the process is to get the local community's perspective. That is the first and the first voice in the process is, what do they think? And then the people who consider that recommendation, next step, I should say the borough presidents have a similar role, but with a broader geographic basis for that. And then their recommendations are brought to the City Planning Commission, which has to put together its idea of citywide policy, which people should understand, with those local perspectives. And sometimes they fit together and sometimes they don't, but they always have to explain why they don't, if they don't. And I think that's an important part of the process. So it's kind of a reconciliation of potentially opposing views. And that the city council is another sort of party to that step of the process. I think that it would be good to see a process where both the planning commission and the council are doing that thing, which is taking the input that's been received all the way through the process and finding ways to reconcile the citywide and the local perspectives. I think to me, that's the core of the process. How exactly to effectuate that is something that we're going to be, I'm sure, discussing more.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Next, we're a little out of order. I'm going to ask Borough President Reynoso to join us. Thank you so much, President.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Should I just start?
Yes, please.
All right. First, I just want to say the testimony by DCP here is a breath of fresh air. It's the first time that I felt like the Department of City Planning actually wants to plan. I just feel in its history, and it's going to seem like a slight, and it might be. I'm perfectly fine with that. In its history, the Department of City Planning zones, it does not plan. And we fought. This is the second time I'm sitting in front of a Charter Revision Commission talking about comprehensive planning. The number one opponents to comprehensive planning, my last go was the Department of City Planning. They spent a lot of time and resources advocating to not do comprehensive planning. And just think about that. A planning division in the largest, greatest city in all of the world was the number one culprit to the demise of a charter revision opportunity to do comprehensive planning. So to hear what Howard was saying to me was amazing and unbelievable. And I'm looking forward to working with DCP to make it the place where planners want to go because they have an opportunity to do something amazing. And I have to say that because I'm deeply frustrated that we're here, 5 or 6 years later, having the same conversation and not having the courage to be leaders in that time and hoping that we can be leaders now. And I want to say this, the last commission was something that I didn't think was of value to the city of New York. Didn't think it had any real purpose. Not this one. This is just looking at you all, my experience with you all. This is real. You guys are real, highly intelligent people that know more about this stuff than most of the people that are going to speak to you. And I'm looking forward to you having the courage to do something that is difficult, but actually get something done. Because what we've lost in New York is the courage to be great. Like the fear holds us back from doing amazing things. And that's not who New York ever was. We built amazing bridges. We set the trend. Now we're scared to do difficult things because of the backlash, I guess, on social media or whatever it is. But we should have the courage to do it. So now I'm going to read my parts of my statement that I think are valuable. I don't want to go back to the Board of Estimates, even though that would be greatly beneficial to me. But the fact that we're even having these conversations, that's exactly what we should be doing. So thank you so much for having me here. As you know, I'm the president of the greatest borough in the state of New York, which is Brooklyn, and I'm happy to have you all here at the best borough, talking about one of my favorite issues, which is housing and land use. You all know I was a big supporter of the City of Yes for housing opportunity because I believe deeply that every neighborhood in the city needs to do its part to solve our housing crisis. And right now, even with the City of Yes, that is not happening. My biggest criticism was that the City of Yes didn't go far enough. So now I'm here to ask you to take the next step, which is citywide comprehensive planning. I'm going to go to the bottom, and I hope we can get into a bit of a conversation. But while housing growth is the most critical part of this, the speaker's fair housing framework is an example of a good start. I want to be clear that comprehensive planning goes beyond housing to take a comprehensive look at how decisions influence quality of life. For example, the comprehensive plan for Brooklyn examines the relationships between land use and access to housing, healthcare, and transportation options, jobs, community services, accessibility, and healthy and resilient environment. In each of these areas, we see stark contrast neighborhood by neighborhood in metrics such as life expectancy, school performance, access to parks and open space, the reach of transportation options, the safety of our streets, the air quality, and the prevalence of health challenges such as diabetes, asthma, maternal mortality, and morbidity. We're all frustrated by how fraught land use has become in New York City. We need to think beyond ULURP as being one of the only mechanisms for communities to engage in planning development conversations. That starts with a comprehensive citywide needs assessment that captures the real needs for facing communities. We need to understand that our vision for a well-planned city requires, and then follow that up with 10-year capital plan to prioritize our investments in response to communities' priorities with a focus on addressing longstanding needs in underserved neighborhoods and preparing for climate change. This transparent, inclusive vision for how land use decisions are made will actually make it easier for development to happen. This commission can start by adding a mandate to the New York City Charter to create a comprehensive plan every 10 years. We can work out the mechanisms in conversation with the next administration and the city council, but for now, we need to a mandate to move this idea forward. We are one of the only major cities that doesn't have a comprehensive plan to guide growth and development. And when voters learn that, they will be excited for us to catch up with the rest of the world. Finally, I want to be clear that I have no intention of asking for development to stop while we create this plan. This is not a stalling tactic. It is an opportunity for an improved process that would help us end the YIMBY NIMBY doom loop and actually deliver for New Yorkers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Any questions for the Borough President?
Mr.
Carl.
Borough President, I know that you made it clear you don't want to see us go back to the Board of Estimate, but I wonder if you think that the role of the Borough President should be enhanced in the planning process, and whether that would help in terms of planning more generally, but also elevating the kinds of concerns that Howard Slacken raised.
I do believe so. It's an unfortunate thing that I am the borough president, and it seems like a bit selfish. But in the conversations that I'm currently having with council members, I have a planning division that is extremely aggressive and informs and educates council members to the best of our ability. And my comprehensive plan gives a borough-wide view of the things we need to do. In Bedford, Bay Ridge, for example, they've created only 68 units of housing over the last since 1968. 68 units. So I think it's a little less than that, but they created a small amount of units. When we present to Bay Ridge doesn't have a comprehensive vision of what's happening in Brooklyn. They see a 10-story building and they think the whole world is out of whack and that they've lost everything and they're gone. In the Bronx, in one councilmatic district, they've built over 20,000 units of housing in less than 10 years. When you give that perspective to a comprehensive plan, it makes people feel like they are part of a team and they're having a conversation about how to help the city. No one's getting picked on. They're not attacking you. Look at this entire city and how it works, and you'll understand what development looks like. I have that perspective as a borough-wide official. I can see what's that in one council member's district, they shut down every single project before it even starts. Should I have any authority? I wouldn't allow that to happen. I would allow the process at least to take its course and get to a place where a vote can happen at the city council or at the borough president's office. I would extend it. But that council member has intrinsic, they have local values or local vision. They're never going to go past that, Carl.
Yeah.
And there's some that do it. We have a couple of council members that do it and they get killed for it. And their jobs are threatened for doing what's good for the city.
And I know you've seen it from both perspectives, both as a council member
Yeah.
and as a borough president.
Uh-huh.
So I would be very interested, not necessarily right now, but if you could suggest
Yeah.
to us
Yeah.
very specific ways that you think the charter could be amended to strengthen the role of the borough president in this process, to establish a broader perspective.
Yeah, so I do think that we should consider flipping the timeline and allowing for the borough president to go after the council member. I just really think that it's to go from a borough-wide view on how development should happen and then go back to a very local view as to what should happen is a backwards system. I'm trying to give a recommendation that's good for the borough. The council member is going to look out for the interest of the city council district. I have a recommendation. So I just really want to speak to what's good for the city is more important than what's good for a local community. And a lot of people do not have that perspective. And I think having a borough president go after the council would be something we could consider. Member deference is a big issue. I was in the city council too. I benefited from all of these things that I'm talking about now, but my perspective is, want to say, evolved or changed since I've become borough president. But I would say that if I were to revert back to being a council member, the interest of the community would be something that is more heightened at a local level than it is at a borough-wide level. So I wouldn't have changed what I've done. But I do think maybe the borough president going after or a better way to at-large seats is something I've heard of as well. Just a way to make it so that the council members have a lot of authority, really set the tone, but that we can get to a place where we're all contributing to the greater good, which is not happening right now. Thank you.
Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Borough President, for your testimony.
Thank you.
I think from what could gather, your position is that the comprehensive planning model gives us better planning. Just want to make sure I understand, are you also suggesting that it facilitates or helps us get development faster as
Yes.
well?
Yes, that's the goal. So the idea here is that we separate infrastructure from housing. Right now, the only way to get a new park in your community is to allow for development to happen and negotiate with the city through a community benefits agreement for perks. That should already be something that happens in the city. I shouldn't have to be worried about the city of Yes and the claim that our sewer system is not sufficient enough to handle the new development that's going to happen. The city should have a rolling infrastructure budget that handles those things regardless of development. The infrastructure should never be something we talk about. It should be a given. It is a necessity for the sustainability of the city. And the housing development then comes after. In a comprehensive plan, what you would do is say, hey, you're near a transit-rich area. You're within a half a block of a train. You have amenities, you have good schools, you have great parks. This is an area where development could happen, and it's zoned at a R5. This is an area of interest. If you are a developer and you go into an area of interest, that we would allow you to speed through the process because you're abiding by the principles of a comprehensive plan. Should you want to exceed the comprehensive plan or do more than what the comprehensive plan is asking, then it goes to ULURP and it goes through a process that's more formal and it slows you down significantly. If you abide by the principles, and this is a R7, R8 area, more or less, we won't name it exactly by the text, but R7, R8 is something that falls within line of the comprehensive plan. You don't even need to go through a ULURP process. You've abided by the comprehensive plan. Also, everyone knows the comprehensive plan. The whole city sees it at the exact same time. There's nothing hidden. The community knows exactly what to expect. Hopefully in a comprehensive plan, we could talk to a community and say, hey, this is a small neighborhood. We're not asking for 20-story towers in Mill Basin. It just doesn't make sense. But we're gonna go from 1 story to 3, from 3 story to 5. But we want you to tell us where you want to see 1,000 units of growth. We're going to ask you where you think your big streets are, but everyone's contributing. And then a developer sees the whole map and they know where the opportunity areas are. They're throughout the entire borough, and they cannot get stopped by our ULURP process if they abide by the principles of the comprehensive plan. It'll speed up development in the city significantly. And you ask any developer right now what the biggest problem is they don't know what they have to negotiate with a council member, and they don't know exactly what the council member is going to be asking for. If you ask a council member what the biggest issue is that we're in the dark on exactly what development what profit margins these developers have. There's no pro formas we're getting. The council members are negotiating in the dark. We're making this up. We truly are. We want 60% affordable housing, and they'll say, we can't do that. It's impossible. The finances don't work. Then show me the finances. Show me that you're not going to get a 8% return on investment. Show it to me so that I could feel bad for you. And then maybe I don't negotiate for 60% and I'll come down to 40 or 50. But we don't see that. So we're just shooting darts in the dark and hoping that we get to a number that the community is satisfied with, that allows for the project to happen. A comprehensive plan solves for almost all of this. And if it again removes the infrastructure development from housing development. And communities are not angry when we do a city of yes, which is a very modest thing that we did. It's the value of the city of yes is that it was a citywide job, that every council member had a vote on it. That was the value of it, that we got a council to work as a body on an important issue. The actual work, it's very insignificant to the development that's going to happen in the city of New York. But there are one-family homes complaining about more people coming into their neighborhoods, and they have combined sewer overflow, and they have issues with their sewers. That's real. That should have been taken care of 20 years ago, so that it's not a part of the conversation. It's completely independent of development, and that doesn't happen right now, and a comprehensive plan could solve for all of that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Borough President. Greatly appreciate it.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hold on. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you always.
All right. So, I don't know everything, so.
Nobody does.
But I appreciate all the information that you bring in. I do want to say, I want to ask you, the thing about infrastructure, how do you see that being funded? I see sometimes, like, if there's a development, especially a significant development coming to a community, and you have a lot of monies that's going towards the development.
Yeah.
How do you see, or do you think that it's the developers that are coming when we're redeveloping a particular area, do you see that they should contribute to infrastructure development, like because of the massive amount of money that is funding the development? Or do you think as I heard you, that it should be separate,
Yeah.
it should be automatic or whatever the case is, that's what the
Yeah.
city should be doing. Or is there a balance that could
Right.
happen in those discussions? I don't know. so
Yeah,
much.
no, so yeah, this is a conversation we should have when we're developing comprehensive planning. I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of them. And I would love for you to go to the Brooklyn Borough President's website and look at our comprehensive plan. Our 2.0, the second part of our comprehensive plan is coming out. And I did that with 5 very dedicated staff members. Imagine what DCP could do. I would say this for that, is that right now, because it's only zoning that we do, is that if one building comes up and it's 10 stories and it's gonna add 50 people to the neighborhood, EIS and the seeker say that that one building is not going to require the need for a new school, for example. Then the next 2 months, another building goes up, and then another building goes up. And individually, each building does not have enough of a contribution of residents to build a school. But now we have 20 of these buildings, and we need a new school. And now the city's on the hook for that work. What we should be doing is that there should be, the comprehensive plan is going to say, with this plan, we expect about 20,000 people coming into this neighborhood. We can start planning for new schools now. And when the city plans long-term, they're building 7 schools in Bay Ridge right now. They're looking for any property. They're overpaying the value of the property because it's a necessity, and the schools are busting out at the seams. They're putting them in locations that don't make any sense because they just need to fill the seats. The seats need to be there. With comprehensive plan, we work more efficiently and more affordably in all this work. And the developers, we should be talking about more affordable housing and doing all this work, but they shouldn't be they shouldn't be footing the bill for the infrastructure. That's the city's responsibility. But what they should be footing the bill for is that we are giving them access to increased value of their property, and they should be doing a public good as well. And market rate housing is a public good, but so is affordable housing. So you won't have to pay for the school, but 25% at MIH is just too small. We're going to increase that number. But we have to look at many other things. Union built housing, right? Like we got people building these apartments that can't live in the apartments that they're building. And that is just nonsensical in the city of New York, all right? If you're a chef, you should be able to buy the food you're cooking. But we can talk about that too. Those are other things that they should be valuing, that we should ask developers to do, but the infrastructure should always be our responsibility. We shouldn't have to wait for a developer to fix our problems. The city should be responsible for that.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
now we're
The
good. All right.
last question.
One more. I'm so
Commissioner?
sorry.
How you doing?
Doing
Mr.
good.
President?
It's impressive.
Good to see you. My question is about the role of community boards in
Yeah.
this, right? I mean, there's this piece around member deference, right? But the
Mhm.
truth is, you're thinking about these 59. What actually reinforces member
Mhm.
deference?
Yeah.
How would you see that kind of relationship shifting or changing in a proposed, as you say, comprehensive plan?
Yeah, I think the role of the community, the city gives them a goal, and they are obligated to fulfill that goal. If they don't fulfill that goal, then the city takes over. So my example is, what we've noticed in our comprehensive plan, or the framework that we're building, we're not there yet, is that in this area, over the next 10 years, we think it can take on 10,000 units of housing. We are going to give you 2 years to tell us where you want to see that happen. If you can't get there, then we're going to do it for you. So we give a community like an ultimatum for all intents and purposes. It's like, we want you to decide. We're not going to tell you how to do it. We're not going to tell you where to do it, but you have to do it. So you find the big streets that you're comfortable with. You find the streets next to maybe subway stations that you think it's appropriate, but you're going to find it. And if the community board can't come to a conclusion and can't come to a plan where they show us where the 10,000 units are going to happen, then we have to intend and do it for them. But we give them an opportunity to go there, to go first. Is an example of a role for a community board that I think has value.
Thank you so
Right.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You guys take care.
All right, good to see you. Next up, I'd like to invite Vishan Chakrabarti of the founder of the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism.
Commissioners, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for inviting me. Unlike many of your other panelists, I don't represent a nonprofit, but as a practicing architect, I'm familiar with the term. I want to talk to you tonight about a project we're working on in our office, a kind of research project, but I firmly believe that this should be a city of 10 million people or more. We have the capacity to be a city of 10 million people or more. We would be a much more vibrant place. We'd have much more innovation. But the thing that we should really keep in mind as we think about some of the discussion we just had, the question about infrastructure that was just raised, is that if we were a city of 10 million people, we would be a much wealthier city that could afford to solve the problems that we have in front of us, because every new resident pays more in taxes than they draw in services. And if you need the evidence for that, all you have to do is look at when we went from 7 million people to 8 million people and how the budget expanded. So we need to make the room and have an affordable city that's at least 10 million or more. And so I have some slides. This was actually for a project we did with the New York Times. Some of you might have seen it last year, where we just took on, we didn't look at zoning at all. We just said, where are the sites that can handle development across the city using the city's database and using metrics that we ourselves established within a half a mile of transit, outside of the flood zones. We found over 10,000 sites, enough for over 520,000 housing units, which would easily get us to 10 million New Yorkers. Let's see how I just changing the slide here. So one of the major things that we wanted to address was this question of neighborhood character. We hear this a lot, and you just heard a lot of that in the borough president's testimony. How do you have buildings that aren't out of scale? So instead of looking at the zoning, as I said, we said, let's look at places near transit, out of the flood zone, and then find all of these infill sites through the city zoning. And we found enough acreage that was twice the size of Central Park. And this is very important in terms of construction and affordability. We tend to talk about affordability as programs and subsidies. We need to understand more about construction to understand affordability, because it's a step function. There's single-family houses. There's 3-story housing units that are built with light gauge steel, don't require elevators, because the American Disabilities Act says you don't need an elevator for a 3-story building, a lot less concrete. Block and plank construction out to about 15 stories, and then larger forms of high rises. Each of those are significantly higher in construction cost per square foot as you go up the scale. So we focused on the 3 in the middle, kind of that low scale apartment, that 5 to 15 story, and that 30 to 50 story. And we said, in terms of neighborhood character, basically we said we wouldn't allow a building that was taller than the tallest building within the radius of a given site. And so there were some before and afters. And so this is a transit-rich neighborhood in the Bronx, single-family neighborhood for the most part, but not all single-family. And there we proposed a 6-unit apartment building. This is the one I got the most hate mail on. A 6-unit apartment building in the Bronx. In Brooklyn, a 1-story building, right, that goes to basically the same height as the neighboring apartment building over to the left, about a 58-story building, excuse me, a 58-unit building, not 58 stories. That's block and plan construction. And then in Queens, about a 250-unit building, again, near a lot of mass transportation. And then we did look at office to residential conversions. Honestly, it delivered very little housing. So this is the interesting thing. Of the 520,000 units, the lion's share came from the mid-rises, the 58-unit buildings in Queens and Brooklyn. We do not believe most of those sites are as of right. But here's the most interesting thing in terms of the response to this article. We actually got a lot of positive response from civic organizations, community organizations, and so forth. We didn't get a great response from the real estate community. The real estate community said, we really don't have the wherewithal to build 58-unit housing projects in Queens and Brooklyn. We were basically built to build much larger housing units. And so you understand the dilemma. We've got the sites. We can build to scale near transportation, but we don't have the builders. And if we're going to say these sites aren't as of right, that means that small scale builders have to go through ULURP, which is almost an impossibility to build where we have the most capacity for housing near transit and out of the flood zones. So I just have a couple of very specific recommendations I want to go through in terms of trying to achieve this. I think we need an omnibus method, either through ULURP, which I think would be tough because a lot of these would be map amendments, or a state GPP, to create as-of-right low-rise housing in low-rise neighborhoods and mid-rise housing in mid-rise neighborhoods when those neighborhoods are near transit out of flood zones. In mid-rise areas near transit, we should make 50 to 60 unit housing projects as of right, as long as they comply with MIH. Such projects can be built out of less expensive block and plain construction. In low-rise areas, make multifamily housing projects lower than 35 feet as of right. These are really important. You can provide a lot of housing at that small scale because, again, you don't need elevators, you don't need concrete. The cost of construction is dramatically lower. In addition, the city has over 1 billion square feet of trapped FAR, right? Meaning the places that can't utilize the density they've got on their sites, not because they don't need more density, but because of use and bulk restrictions. And I believe, it'd be difficult, but I believe we should use the minor mod process, not the major mod process, to avoid ULURP, to change use and bulk restrictions on any number of sites. And we can unlock a lot of FAR without doing any upzonings. I'm going to stop there. I just want to close with this thing. We've heard a lot about comprehensive planning. I went to planning school with Commissioner Greenberger. I'm all for comprehensive planning. But at the same time, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We clearly have a housing crisis. We are going the opposite of having 10 million people in this city, as Vicky has already talked about. And we have to put the folks in orange shirts behind us to work, right? And so we have to do that by creating more as of right housing as soon as possible while we work on a comprehensive plan. Those two things are not contradictory to each other. And lastly, I really like the idea of the borough president going last, not before council. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I just want to follow up on your 1 billion square feet of untapped or trapped FAR.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, untapped or trapped. Where is that predominantly located?
It's all over the city,
It's
Sharon. It's
literally
all
Sharon.
over the city. I was working with a client, not last week, where they have the ability to deliver over 2,000 housing units on their site. And they can do that with the density that is mapped on their site, but they cannot get the use and bulk restrictions lifted without a full-scale ULURP to achieve those
So it's
2,000
use
units.
in bulk. It's not that it's already been all used prior in other ways.
It's use and bulk. And the bulk restrictions are often like the most deadening.
Is part of what you're saying that, like the example you just gave, they'd have to go through a full scale ULURP. Are you saying because of the size and scale of who they are and the type of builder that's going through that is too costly, or what becomes the barrier?
Yeah, because so again, I mean, I think the elephant in the room here is the development community. Because when people talk about more housing, everyone talks about, well, then you're helping the real estate developers, right? The thing is that the more regulations we throw into the land use system, the more you're helping big real estate. Because only big real estate can afford the attorneys and the lobbyists and everyone else you need to get around those regulations. And what we're hurting are all the small builders, the community scale builders who can build on the kinds of sites that we just talked about, right? And so and when you say, so why do these things need to go through ULURP? Sometimes they don't have the density on the site. Often it's because there's some stupid rear yard regulation or some other thing that's a technicality in the zoning code that means that they need to go through a full ULURP. And there's a minor mod process where it's left up to the discretion of the city planning chair. And I think we should be using that much more for these kinds of small scale sites because small builders cannot afford the process that we would have to put them through otherwise.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for your testimony.
Sure.
And you talked about reframing the conversation around affordability. And so I want to make sure that I'm understanding your position is that the creation of more as of right housing is a direct correlation to increasing affordability?
No, that's not what I was saying, sir. What I was actually trying to get at is that we constantly talk about affordability as how much subsidy we can throw at things. And we have finite resources, we always will. And we have to have, I believe, a land use system that can build as of right housing that is affordable to working people without subsidy. And I think the only way you can get there is to, yes, have much, much more construction, but also fundamentally to be able to build, especially where there's a lot of sensitivity in these low-rise neighborhoods, But if you can, and this is done all over the country, there's nothing particularly unique about this, where you can build 6 or 10 unit apartment buildings, again, out of light gauge construction, fairly low cost per square foot, right? In transit-rich neighborhoods that are low rise, that aren't 10-story buildings, but are 3-story buildings. I mean, a lot of single-family houses are 35 feet tall, right? So you can actually pack a lot of density into that height with a low construction cost and get what I would call naturally occurring affordability, so that we can keep precious subsidy dollars for where we most need them.
Are you done? Thank you. So I'm thinking out loud. So what you're suggesting is that for those low density projects or the 3 to 5, that we eliminate the ULURP process entirely. We just go
Exactly.
straight to as of right. You don't think that would be somewhat controversial though amongst locality?
Controversial, we're at the Charter Revision Commission here. I mean,
True.
no, of course,
Is that the
of
Carpenters General
course it would,
Membership meeting,
no,
actually?
of course it would be, but we need much more as of right housing
Mhm.
if for all of the reasons that have been discussed for the last hour and a half, right? City planning, where I'm a former and proud employee, is incredibly overstressed. The Manhattan office that I used to run, I believe, had 32 people when I ran it. I think it's 19 or 20 now, right? Because of city budget cuts. You know, we don't have the bandwidth in our system. And so we just need to create much more as of right housing. The question is, how do we create as of right housing that people don't outright reject in their communities because they feel like it's a scale that makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Can be built at a cost that makes sense for small and mid-sized builders and not just the 10 billionaires that control the real estate industry. And how can that housing then be affordable for our workforce? And I think that's not going to happen unless it's as right, because you cannot build the smaller and mid-sized housing that was just in those images if those builders have to go through ULURP. It's impossible.
How do you avoid the extensive litigation? So again, they're not subject to ULURP. There's no such thing as, having to deal with the borough president and the council member, whoever the local electeds are, the community board, but the opposition may still remain. So let's assume somebody immediately goes to court and, files a lawsuit to prevent this development. You don't foresee that as a potential
Well,
problem?
I think the thing is there would have to be a process to get to what I'm talking about,
Mhm.
right? And again, I think it might be a state process. I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure. I don't know
Could
what
be.
could happen. Because the problem here is to look at those 10,000 sites scattered across mainly 4 boroughs, because Staten Island doesn't have that much transit-rich sites available.
No, we don't.
Right? But mainly across 4 boroughs. Those are, to use ULURP technicality, those are a series of map amendments. City of Yes was very precisely built around a set of text amendments, right? Because map amendments trigger a lot of things in terms of ULURP. So I think it's a state GPP. I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer, but I think we need some kind of omnibus measure that lets this smaller and mid-scale stuff happen. During that time, there will be a process. There'll be an EIS. Opponents can oppose, they can advocate, they can sue, they can do all of those things. And when the dust settles, something will hopefully come of it that's positive.
Thank you.
So,
I have a request for you and the others who have already testified. We've talked a lot about sort of how would you reduce barriers or change processes and things like that, which I think are important, but I think a couple of us asked for you to come back with ideas. Would you also think about, for lack of a better word, a shared incentivized process? And it might not just be financial, it might be timing, it might be process, it might be expediting things, because it's some combination of those things. So when you come back to us, use that frame as well.
Can I?
yeah, give me the last question, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you, like, if you were doing it the way that you're proposing, what are the numbers look like? What are the unit numbers look like with that?
Sure, Commissioner. So that proposal, and I can send you, I think your staff has it on the Charter Revision Commission. They can send you the link to the article. It generated about 520,000 new units of housing across the city. About 330,000 of those came from mid-rise, so about 50 to 60 unit housing projects. The rest mainly came from those smaller scale ones. So not a lot from high rises, very little from office to residential conversion for a lot of reasons we can talk about. And so again, how we get that mid-rise engine working means both sites that we need to unlock and a smaller scale development community that needs to be able to do these things at the community level, not just at the kind of level of big glassy towers in Manhattan.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. So just for awareness, we have one more invited testimony, then we're going to open up to public testimony. And just so you can be prepared, the first two speakers from the public will be Anne Marie Gray and Robert Taberzi. So as soon as we hear from Mr. Anbinder, I would ask those two to come up. And so our last testimony is from Jacob Anbinder of Cornell University, who is attending virtually. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. I want to thank the members of the commission for having me here today. And I particularly want to thank my fellow panelists. It's really an honor to be in their company. My name is Jacob Anbinder, and I'm a historian of urban politics and housing policy, currently serving as a Klarman postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University. And I'm writing a book that's due out the year after next called NIMBY Nation, the War on Growth That Created Our Housing Crisis and Remade American Politics. That gives you a sense of my position on this question. So my work really deals with two questions broadly. The first is, how did housing in places like New York City, New York City is one of the places I look at, but also cities in California and sort of the Northeast more broadly, how did housing in these places become so scarce over the last 40, 50 years? So I take sort of the long view compared to some of the people who've spoken today. And second, what does this shortage have to do with places like New York simultaneously becoming the most reliably democratic parts of the country? And it's this apparent contradiction that some of our most liberal communities, starting in the 60s, 70s, and continuing through today, are also the most opposed to new housing. And that's what really piqued my interest as a political historian. But I should start by saying that my interest in this topic is not purely academic. It started because I experienced the New York City housing crunch firsthand, not as someone a month's rent away from being on the street, but rather as one of the millions of New Yorkers, or former New Yorkers in my case, for whom a college degree and a white-collar job were really barely enough to afford a home that was sturdy and safe and spacious in the city. And yet, when I would talk to my neighbors in Park Slope or in Harvard Square when I went to grad school, or even here in Ithaca now, some of the most ostensibly liberal people that you're supposed to find anywhere in the country, I would find that they were at best ignorant of the housing crisis that was going on in their own backyards, or more often believed that opposing development was actually part and parcel with their identities as liberals. And so I want to start by thanking the Commission, not just for the work of revising the city charter in its sort of technical aspects, but for working to change the moral conversation around housing in a way that's sorely needed, not just in New York, but really in progressive cities from coast to coast. Because even though it's tempting to believe that housing in the city has always been expensive, the data show, and other people have spoken about this today as well, that we're at a point now that is really unprecedented in recent history. The two-bedroom house that Jane Jacobs owned in the Village is worth nearly 1,000 times what she paid for it in 1947. The Atlantic called housing recently the linchpin of the great affordability crisis breaking America. And these runaway housing markets in New York City and elsewhere are having noticeable social effects. In the 60s, about 1 in 5 Americans moved in a given year. Now the figure is less than half that. And through their inability to buy a home in places like New York, many people are not only excluded from what has become in this day and age the dominant mode of wealth building in America, but are increasingly unable to even live in the same parts of the country as those who had the good fortune to invest in real estate decades ago. And the core premise of my work is really quite simple. Housing is scarce and expensive today because we made it illegal to build more of it in the places where people want to live. In 1961, New York City changed its zoning code to cut the number of homes that could exist in the city by 80%. In 1975, voters approved several provisions put forward by a charter commission similar to this one, which created the modern system of community boards as well as the ULURP procedure, and removed authority over the capital budget from the City Planning Commission. And this is an episode that I address in my book and can discuss more in the Q&A. So New York City, in other words, wasn't always a city of no. It chose to become a city of no. And in particular, New York liberals decided to embrace an ideology of no at a discrete moment in time in a belief that it would ameliorate the harms of the pro-growth policies that remade the city in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so if I want to leave this commission with one idea, it's that we need not cast aspersions on those community control ideas that predominated in the past in order to begin remedying their unintended consequences. I always tell my students that history is not about using the present to render judgment on the past. It's about using the present to understand the motivations of people in the past. And so we need only remind ourselves that the New York of today is a very different place from the one in which Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses lived, a place that faces an entirely different set of problems from the ones that they and their contemporaries grappled with. And I think today, New York City is a city that wants to grow and prosper, if only we will let it. Thank you again, and I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you so much for your perspective. I ask a question. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, it's a very helpful historic perspective, but let's talk about trust, because I think some of the processes that we describe that, as you say, are no longer doing the work they intended to do are reactions to a well-earned distrust of pick your poison, developers, city planners of the past. And so how would you think about a system that addresses the core problem, which is that it's not surprising if you constrain supply, it has an effect on cost, with the very, I think, well-earned desire by communities to have a voice in how their communities develop?
Absolutely. It's such a good question, and in fact, it gets to many of the themes that I talk about when I talk about the 75 charter revision. The core reason that reforming city government to devolve city planning power to the level of the community boards, the core reason that that became so popular in the 70s was that similar to today, it was an era of low trust in government, not just in city government. This was an era when crime was much higher than it is today. The city budget obviously was facing calamity. It was not clear if your garbage was going to get picked up in a given week. And then, of course, low trust at the same time in the federal government manifested in things like Watergate in opposition to the Vietnam War. I think a core issue, and I realize that this doesn't answer your question so much as contextualize it. A core issue for you guys today is that we are in an era when, in some ways, trust in government is not that much higher than it was in the 70s. And in some aspects, you might argue that it's lower. The one thing that I will say that creates an opportunity here is that it's clear from seeing how land use politics works in New York City today that all the parties that were on board with the system that was put in place in the 70s and modified in the 90s, nearly all parties today agree that that system no longer serves really the interests of anyone except maybe the most NIMBY interest groups in the city. And as Professor Bean pointed out, a system that was supposed to give neighborhoods the ability to sort of plan their own future has instead resulted in, one might even argue, overdevelopment in neighborhoods that are more vulnerable, that communities that have less political say, and underdevelopment in neighborhoods where it's the opposite. And so I would say that my advice to you guys, and it's difficult, but it needs to be done, is to try to find a way to frame the changes that need to be made to the city's land use policies in sort of moral and ideological terms that take advantage of and harness that mistrust, and attempt to present to people an answer as to why the system that's going to be put in place more adequately responds to the dissatisfaction that people have with the current system and how it's produced this housing shortage.
I may be way off with this one. But there was something that you said, and it could be, and I'm always humble with this, my lack of understanding. Did, is there a racial dynamic when we look at the past, coming up to the present, that we have to also factor in when we're making these decisions. A lot of it, my humble understanding, there was always a racial dynamic here in New York City when it came to city planning and all of these things that affect how we develop housing in various communities. I don't know if you covered that or if you articulated that, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And the politics of race as they relate to this history in New York City are complicated. And what I mean is it's hard to point to, when you talk about the era of sort of the master builder, Robert Moses, moving into the era of community control, moving into maybe the next era of a sort of more pro-housing New York. One of the constants is that there have always been sort of political coalitions, agreements, where some sides have believed that the new system that's being put in place will serve communities of color better. And it's almost never really been the case that actually pans out. So I'll be more specific. Obviously, I think the ways in which the era of urban renewal disproportionately harmed communities of color, those are well studied, well known, and have been well documented in everything from history books to fiction to movies. When you talk about moving into the sort of community board era, the era of ULURP, you had your sort of do-gooders, people who genuinely in their heart of hearts believed that devolving power to the community boards was necessary to affect their vision of social progress. But we can't overlook that at the same time, a considerable part of the political support in favor of implementing that framework that exists today was also made up of reactionary racists. So you think of the extremely controversial plan to put public housing in Forest Hills in the early 70s. I talk about this in my book, and there were many politicians in New York City in the 70s who directly attributed the growing interest among their constituents in serving on a community board to wanting to oppose public housing in the same way that people opposed it in Forest Hills. And that was a sort of semi-successful opposition where they cut the amount of public housing in half, and they gave preference to people who already had roots in the neighborhood. And so 70% of the public housing tenants in Forest Hills, when that project ended up opening, were white. And so, it's hard for me I think we should avoid sweeping claims that one system or another will necessarily create better conditions when we talk about the effects of development on vulnerable urban communities. I think it's important to remember that people with the least political power in the city bearing the brunt of these changes, whether they be in favor of development or against development, that's been a constant throughout the city's history. And it's important to keep those in mind and think about ways to safeguard that and remedy that as we move into a sort of post-ULURP era, if that's what indeed we're doing here.
Well, thank you so much for your testimony, incredibly helpful. Thank you. So we're going to move to the public part of our testimony. Our first speakers are Anne Marie Gray and Robert Taberzi. One thing I'm going to ask if they come to the table, we have a lot of speakers, not a lot of time. I'm going to be pretty, forgive me if I'm rude, I'm going to be pretty aggressive about cutting folks off at 3 minutes. And I'm going to ask if people in the audience, just to be respectful of whoever's testifying, so that we can hear them. Thank you so much. Anne Marie.
Thank you. My name is Anne Marie Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Open New York, an independent grassroots pro-housing nonprofit with hundreds of volunteer members across the state and city. So there's been so much fantastic expert testimony. We are really focused on how do we build more homes. We really strongly believe displacement, exclusion, tenant harassment, homelessness are all exacerbated by this housing shortage, and that for far too long, many of the most well-resourced parts of the city have been essentially off limits to helping solve the problem. Jumping in that we went ahead and released a policy brief yesterday called A Charter for Housing Equity, 5 Reforms for a Fairer, More Affordable NYC, which I encourage you to read in full. A really quick summary of the 5 ideas that we put out there that we're very excited to discuss. One, create a fast track for fair housing. So we need a new approvals process for proposals that would advance fair housing in our most transit-rich, climate-resilient, and low-growth neighborhoods, in line with the implementation of Speaker Adams' Fair Housing Framework to ensure that it has real teeth. In these well-resourced neighborhoods, often the whitest, wealthiest neighborhoods, we must fast-track approvals to remove the ability for a local council member to block new homes. These reforms are actually really common in other states. They're often known as builders' remedies in correcting for this imbalance. Number two, streamline advisory reviews in ULURP. This is actually in line with the Citizens Budget Commission recommendation as well. Local input into the city's land use review process prioritizes those with the most time, money, and connections. And actually, many places around the country have adopted better community engagement practices that are more representative and less reactionary. So we should combine the separate community board and borough president advisory reviews in ULURP, bring them together with additional borough president oversight, improve techniques, and a borough-wide lens. Three, make public land work for affordable housing. So city is by far the largest landowner in the 5 boroughs, but turning city-owned land into affordable housing is bureaucratic and slow. We should establish an expedited process to do just that. 4, factor housing needs into landmarks decisions. The Landmarks Preservation Commission is actually limited by the charter itself in what factors it can consider in making critical decisions. And this is especially severe in the city's most well-resourced neighborhoods. So we should ensure that housing affordability and availability are part of the discussion when LPC makes its decisions. 5, strengthen city agencies for better results. The charter has not actually updated the roles and responsibility of agencies to face 21st century challenges. So we should allow stronger oversight and accountability to increase its effectiveness. We have a couple specific ideas in the report itself. So we have a rare chance to reform the charter, so every New Yorker has a fair shot at living where they choose. We're looking forward to continuing working with you, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Anne Marie?
Anne Marie, a question about the landmarks issue. How do you envision that actually working? Sort of what would landmarks really be considering relative to housing?
A couple things that we put into the report, and really excited to talk about this more. One, for example, they could work with other city agencies who already think and are required to think about the housing crisis in evaluating the impact on a new historic district on housing sites, housing opportunity sites. Same with, we've actually lost 100,000 units of housing over the last couple decades in consolidations of historic, used to be 15 apartment buildings into one massive mansion. They're not actually evaluating the impact of that loss, the loss of apartments in their decisions, and they should be required to do that.
Thank you. And just to alert folks, the next 2 speakers will be Alicia Boyd and Rod Herbert. Now we'll hear from Robert Taberzi.
Good evening. My name is Robert Taberzi. I'm a Brooklyn resident and a proud member of Construction and General Building Laborers Local 79. Our union is the largest construction laborers local in the United States with over 10,000 members, the majority of whom live in the 5 boroughs. Laborers Local 79 calls on the New York City Charter Revision Commission to include strong labor standards when proposing changes to our city's housing and land use policies. Economic development will only succeed if it invests in the workers that build our city. We must not forget that the housing crisis we face is also a low-wage crisis. We can fast-track the building of affordable housing, but only if the fast track is coupled with city subsidies, which require a $40 per hour minimum compensation package for construction workers with strong local hire provisions. A bill before the City Council that includes these standards could pair with an expedited review process for affordable housing to make sure that all New Yorkers are served by the charter reform process. Over 40 New York City Council members have already signed on as co-sponsors of this bill called the Construction Justice Act. This bill sets a just $40 wage and benefit standard on city-financed affordable housing projects and also includes strong local hiring provisions for communities most in need. We have an opportunity to build more housing and faster while ensuring that our communities get family-sustaining jobs. As we consider charter reform, let's make sure that a just wage and community hiring is part of every proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Robert? All right, thank you so much. Our next up will be Alicia Boyd and Rod Herbert. Ms. Boyd, welcome.
Hi, my name is Alicia Boyd, and I'm a political activist in the Crown Heights Flatbush. I have been a strong advocate against development and high-rise development and gentrification in my neighborhood. All the experts that you have in front of you have never once talked about gentrification and displacement. You talked about, oh, the opportunity for developers to build more and build faster, and oh my God, it's so expensive for them, and oh, we got to do this. But not one person that you have asked to talk about what are the effects of all of this gentrification, this development. District 35, Crown Heights, Flatbush, downtown, has the highest rate of development in Brooklyn. Oh, we have our share, but we also have the highest rate of evictions. And who are the ones who are evicted? Black people. Black people are a part of this process that continues to focus on Black communities, communities of color. When they talked about those 10 communities that produced all of this development, did anybody talk about the fact that they're all communities of color? Did anybody sit there and give you documentation about how much displacement has happened as a result of that? Did anybody talk about affordability? Okay, so right in my neighborhood, which is we got all of the key points. We have next to transit, we're next to Prospect Park. We are, that's about all that you require, low-rise community. Last time, we just got a rezoning in our neighborhood. The target population for the affordable housing was $141,000 starting. $3,500 for a studio. My neighborhood has $55,000 annual income. So what is that development going to do? That's going to provide us with a little bit of affordable housing. It's going to put so much pressure on the existing residents in that community. This board needs to start talking about not the term affordability. It needs to be talking about what targets are you going to plan to ensure that communities of color whose average median income is $55,000 is not getting affordable housing that's $141,000. There needs to be a concern for the residents. People are leaving this city because of lack of affordability, but they're also leaving this city because they can't afford to live here. If you're making $30,000 a year, you have a 6% chance of finding an apartment in New York City. And nothing that has come through, nothing, City of Yes, none of them are addressing those people. None are addressing the people who make $30,000.
Thank you so much, Ms. Boyd. We're at time. Any questions? And I'm going to ask if we can, thank you. I want to make sure that we have time for everybody any questions for Ms. Boyd? No, so,
Well, she has a question.
I'm
I
sorry.
but I know we're short on time, but I just, you described a problem that exists in neighborhoods that have become desirable. It's, the first hearing, I talked about how I grew up in Astoria. I wound up in Staten Island because I got priced out of Astoria, and now we're running out of space on Staten Island. So part of the problem is in neighborhoods like Crown Heights, which 30 years ago, no one wanted to move to. Now everyone wants to move there, and it's driving up the cost. And then you couple that with the development. How do we deal with that? I mean, how do we keep the affordable rents and or home ownership opportunities that were always there, and allow for development at the same time? Because we know we need to grow this city, and we know we need to build more housing, because even if you're able to stay there, you have kids and grandkids who aren't going to be able to stay in the neighborhood that they grew up in, or buy a house there, or rent an apartment, because those opportunities have disappeared. So how do we tackle that? And if you don't know, I don't know the answer, and I've been in this business a long time. I'm just like, how do we get at that problem?
Well, one of the things you can do is when a community sits down and actually does a community plan, and there have been community plans, enforce that community plan. Too often, and even Borough President Reynoso himself created a community plan, and then the Department of City Planning refused to pass it. And so he used his community deference, and he said no to that plan. So why aren't you allowing the community to actually create these plans? Because we know our neighborhood the best. We know where we can truly have housing the heights, the affordability. We know that, but every time we create a plan, we give it to the Department of City Planning, they drop it in the garbage and they replace it with their own plan. And then you have the community outrage that there is a plan now sitting in place that's being passed that the community did not support. So what the city charter should start to do is start to empower community boards to create these plans and demand that they be put in place, because we know our communities best. And if we actually had that power, more communities would engage in that. But right now, there's not a community in New York City that will want to engage with a district-wide rezoning plan with the Department of City Planning because of its history. So I think that should be what you should do, empower the community boards, not take our voices away.
Thank you so much. Any other questions for Ms. Boyd? And before, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, wow, this is a hard one.
It's hard living in New York
Truth
City.
to power, I love it. So, what I'm trying to learn is some solutions and stuff like that, and you're speaking to a lot of that. In my limited awareness, I'm just trying to wonder, how do we fund the type of developments that allow for the affordability? I think some of the developments that happen and they target communities of, where the predominant population is people of color, is because, it's easier to build there, it's more cost effective, et cetera. And they'll find a way to make the money, right? So that's where we start to talk about zoning and fair share and stuff like that. Being able to spread it throughout the city and find other opportunities. But if they're coming to our community, like, how do we have the discussion? Where do we have that discussion, whether it's community board, residents, et cetera? How do we have that to where we can balance it out to actually bring the development and make it make sense?
Well, I think you can look at Charles Barron's East New York district. He did a wonderful job using city council deference and ensuring that nothing that came into his community was not benefiting his community. I saw the 6-story high-rise developments. I saw the $500 for studio apartments. I saw the 3-bedroom apartments for between $850 and $1,000 with my own eyes. He was strong, he advocated for his residents, and he got the development. So why aren't we demanding that in our city charter? Why aren't we demanding that area medium income be the target for any development coming into a community? That's a way. If you want to come and build in here, then if you're going to provide us housing, then it has to be at the AMI of the local community. Why hasn't that been happening? Why can't that happen? Well, he did it. So why don't you ask him how it was done? He's still around.
Thank you so much. And before you testify, Mr. Herbert, the next two speakers will be Sarah Pennenberg and Ben Weinberg. And I want to note that we have about 30 speakers and about 45 minutes left in our time. So I'm going to ask everyone to be respectful so people can have their voice. Mr. Herbert.
All right, so I'll be quick. I don't know if I could follow a discussion like Ms. Boyd, but I'll be very brief. All right, so with regards to the ULURP process, right? Many of my bosses have told me in the past that if there's a problem with a certain process, don't look to change it, but look to improve on it. Right? So how do you improve on it? What's known as an operational self-assessment, right? Not just have 5, 6, or 4 people in a room to discuss the ULURP process and make a change. You have to have a broad scope of individuals together in a room, have them tear apart the process, and then rebuild it. It's a painful process to go through, right? I've done about 12 operational self-assessments, right, for large projects and small projects. It does work, right? And the concern that many of the community boards have, when I speak to other community board members, is the term as of right. Because what happens is that many of the homeowners and the long-time community members, they feel that they're going to be pushed out. And that's how they look at that term, as of right. Right? I also know a couple of people in Queens that as of right scares them because they have these solar panels on their homes and they're afraid that they will no longer have the use of the sun to use their solar panels because of as of right construction. All right. So what happens? You have a process. Don't look to change it. Look to improve it. That's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
Okay.
No, all right. All right, thank you so much. Next up, we have Sarah Pennenberg and Ben Weinberg. All right.
Good evening, Charter Review Commission. My name is Sarah Pennenberg, and I'm here on behalf of SEIU Local 32BJ. 32BJ is the largest union for property service workers in the country, representing over 170,000 members in 13 states, including tens of thousands of commercial property service workers, security officers, airport workers, and residential building staff in New York City. 32BJ believes that the city ULURPS process is a vital democratic process through which our community members and groups, including labor unions, have the opportunity to engage with developers and shape that projects and help shape New York City. Through decades of involvement in the city's ULURP process, our union has been able to defend hard-won industry standards and benefits and to educate the real estate industry and legislators about the importance of creating good jobs in the property service sector. At the same time, our union understands the urgency of New York City's housing crisis, and we recognize that confronting this huge crisis and the importance of this for our leadership and policymakers, advancing solutions to facilitate the productions of hundreds of thousands of new homes of housings as soon as possible. We are hopeful to the Charter Commission in considering amendments to the ULURP process and the Commission's proposal to balance the pressure needed to build more housing with the importance of preserving and representing this democracy in this reviewing process. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Thank you so much. And after Mr. Weinberg, next up will be Larry Nickens and Dennis Ibrick. Please forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Mr. Weinberg.
Thank you. My name is Ben Weinberg, and I'm the Director of Public Policy at Citizens Union. I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak before you today. Citizens Union is a nonpartisan good government group committed to reforming city and state government by fostering accountability, honesty, and the highest ethical standards, advocating for political reform and fair and open elections. New York City is facing a serious housing crisis and has a severe housing shortage, a shortage in housing units overall and affordable housing in particular. It needs to produce more housing and provide better opportunities for New Yorkers to obtain and remain in reasonable housing. We very much appreciate the Commission's goal to review sections of the city charter addressing planning, housing, and development, and to recommend changes that would improve the state of housing in our city. We heard a lot of views here today about ULURP timelines and other sections of the charter related to housing. We are not opining at this time on individual changes you may be considering to these sections. However, we do wish to comment on recent proposal to substantially alter the powers of city officials on land use matters. Specifically, you will likely hear receive proposal aimed at shifting final decision-making power on land use matters from the council to the executive branch or the planning commission or other entities. This raises fundamental questions about the structure of city government and the system of checks and balances. So we would like to give our opinion on that matter. As a general matter, Citizens Union believes that the problem of New York City housing is not a problem of the New York City Charter, but rather of a lack of a more comprehensive vision and coordination between the executive and legislative branches. Our housing shortage, in other words, is not the result of flaws in the structure of government, but how these branches of government operated and the politics that drove and still drive their decisions. And we heard from other speakers that in past decades, the city has taken a piecemeal approach to dealing with housing and planning. And the city council, in approving or disapproving those narrow proposals, it's also generally deferred to one or two council members. It is therefore gratifying to see some recent shifts in political wind, including the city of Yes. I'll wrap up and say, we believe that the keys for such further successes like the CDRES are the willingness of the executive branch to develop and present housing and other development programs of broad scope wherever possible, and the willing of the mayor and the council to coordinate from an early stage in such programs. Continuing the political jockeying between the City Planning Commission and the council on narrow proposal is a steep price to pay for the millions of city residents who cannot find or afford a place to live. We also note that as a general principle, zoning is a law which determines how land may be used, and therefore changes to that law should rest in the hands of the council as the legislative body. The mayor has a strong role in this process through the City Planning Commission, which has the sole power to introduce plans, control the land use agenda, and decide what
So we're at
proposal to
time-
bring before the
We're at
council.
time, Mr. Weinberg.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Weinberg?
I do, just briefly. So first to the young lady from 32 Beach, I just want to be clear. You're suggesting that in the ULURP process, whatever reforms are made, we retain the protection for labor standards and prevailing wage, et cetera, and all those things. And I'm assuming the carpenters and the laborers and everybody agrees with that concept.
Yes.
Okay. Ben, I'm somewhat confused.
Yes.
So are you suggesting we keep the ULURP process the way it is? We upend it? And maybe I didn't understand, but I could not quite follow what you were recommending.
And I'm sorry if I was unclear. We are not opining about the initial phases of the ULURP process, only about the question of who has the final say over land use matters, whether it is the city council as the legislative body or any other part of city government. As this is maybe a kind of like a preemptive opinion to some of the opinions we have heard around the discussion before this hearing, and probably you will hear later on about shifting the final decision-making power on land use matters from the city council to the executive.
So you're anticipating.
Anticipate, always good to anticipate.
Okay. Thank you.
And can I ask the question, Mr. Weinberg?
Please.
What impact did that then have on the challenges we've discussed around the obstacles to developing housing? What then would be the reform? if
So-
any?
So again, many of the proposals that were heard today are do not necessarily involve the question of who has that final decision-making powers. And they are positive reforms, which I'm sure we would support many of them. The one issue I think we all agree on is member deference as kind of an inside issue of the legislative branch, which it seems like most of the people around here, including us, are not in favor of, and we are aware of the problems and difficulties of actually legislating member deference or regulating it through the city charter. However, our point is kind of broader about who has the final say over land use matters and whether that should be the legislative body or any other, or the executive. And our concern is really about shifting too much power to the executive in the kind of final say over where things get built.
Thank you, understood. Thank you both so much. Next up, Larry Nickens and Dennis Ibrick. And following Larry and Dennis would be Catherine Vaughn and Yvonne Roman. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Dennis Ibrich. I am speaking on behalf of the 20,000 men and women of the New York City District Council of Carpenters. Every day, our members are risking their lives to build New York City. Numerous press reports have suggested that this commission is seeking to limit member deference and weaken the ULURP process. What this commission must understand is that while imperfect, member deference and ULURP remains the only mechanism that forces powerful real estate interests to make concessions to the community and ensures construction workers are paid enough to afford the very affordable housing they build. This job used to be a ticket to the middle class. Now, the amount of construction workers on government assistance is above average when compared to other industries. That is why we cannot support and will aggressively oppose any effort to erode the power of elected officials to protect our members on projects in their districts. If the commission wants to pursue targeted common sense reforms to speed up the process, that is a conversation worth having, but it cannot come at the expense of responsible development and working New Yorkers. With as much humility as I can muster, I'd like to remind everyone that whether in Albany or City Hall, every time we have engaged in land use fight over the past 4 years, the Carpenters Union has always won. We hope for a constructive dialogue. But on behalf of the workers of New York City, union and non-union alike, we will be ready if it is not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Eagle. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for missing out. Sorry for mispronouncing your name earlier, Mr.
That's fine.
Ibrish.
Ibrich, yeah.
Ibrish, sorry about that. I have a question and open up to the, so you talked about being open to common sense targeted reforms. Are there particular reforms that you would recommend or be open to?
I would, if I would be able to, I would like to at least send an email of a full detailed approach on it. If I could get your email at the end of this, please.
Thank you. And the email address, I believe it's chartertestimony at, oh my gosh, I forgot. Can somebody remind me what the email address is? citycharter.nyc.gov. Okay. So chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. And that's true for anyone who plans to testify but is not able to stay. Please do submit written testimony. We'll all be reviewed. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I did. I wanted to say first, I'm a daughter of a carpenter, so I just want to say that.
Awesome.
From Brooklyn. So I just wanted to push a little bit further on that. When you send that email, I'm curious to also hear not just what would be some of the solutions or suggestions for an expedited process, but also for a process that still includes community board input as well too. So if you can add those, that's my request.
Absolutely.
First, thank you guys for coming tonight and testifying. And you said something interesting that every time you, whether it's in Albany or in City Hall, when you guys are opposed to something, you support something, you manage to deliver it. And quite honestly, a lot of the changes to housing law and financing and the development that is needed for this city would not have happened without the partnership either in Albany or in City Hall with the carpenters, with the laborers, with the entire building trades, and then in fact, the labor movement in general, because we know how hard it is for working people to be able to find a place to live in this city. But many of the projects that your guys are going to have gone to work on, it's taken forever to get them to shovels in the ground. So I think what we're looking for is, are there recommendations coming from either the carpenters or the building trades writ large as to what we can do to speed up that process? So not only do you guys get to work sooner, but you might even get an opportunity to live in some of these buildings that you're building. And if you don't know the answer, that you can share with us later, but I'm just curious as to what the perspective of the building trades is on this.
Right. So I can't speak for the building trades, but I can definitely in that email speak for what the carpenters have a plan as. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate it. Thank you. Next, we have Catherine Vaughn and Yvonne Roman. That's it. Thank you for coming. Okay. Ms. Vaughn.
Hi, have much less of an audience now. My name is Catherine Vaughn. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of Abundance New York. Abundance New York, we're a community of 2,000 New Yorkers who believe that our city's superpowers are growth and change. We want to see New York that can build enough housing for the extreme demand and build transit and climate infrastructure as well for the 21st century. And we represent what Howard Slotkin referred to as a quiet majority of people who hope to be a counterweight to what we see as undue and just too much NIMBY influence in a lot of these processes. And in addition to running Abundance New York, I'm a member of Brooklyn's Community Board 6, and I'm a mother of 2 young children and a renter. So it's a personal issue for me as well. Our housing crisis is undeniable. Rents are rising at 7 times faster than wages, and hit a record high of $3,500 median rent in Brooklyn last year. 55% of households are rent burdened, and we have the lowest rental vacancy rate that we've seen in 50 years. And yet, as speaker after speaker has described, the processes for approving new housing are broken. From the ULURP process to member deference, which gives individual members a veto over citywide housing priorities, to specific participants in the ULURP process that are not representative of their communities, namely community boards. So as we think about some of these process changes, I have 3 Ps here. Can the purview of ULURP change? Can the process change, and can the participants change? So in terms of the purview, we had speakers like Borough President Reynoso talk about comprehensive planning and more goal-driven processes. Can we set goals and targets by district about how much housing should be built with an eye toward discrepancies and inequities that have happened in the past, and think about what is appropriate for each district, and then fast track projects through the ULURP process. Can we think about the disposition of public land differently, as Anne Marie Gray from Up in New York mentioned, thinking about fast tracking processes for building affordable housing on city-owned land. And then finally, not housing related, but all sorts of land use projects are required and subject to ULURP, like bus shelters. And that doesn't seem like a good use of time. So thinking about what can be removed or exempt from ULURP. Can the process change? Reynoso suggested switching the order of borough presidents and council members. Open New York has recommended a streamlined process that combines the community board and borough president steps. Since borough presidents have oversight of community boards already, that could be a good consolidation of processes where the BP would ultimately oversee and kind of coordinate community board input. And finally, speaking of community boards, thinking about the participants in this process, community boards play an important, if advisory, role in ULURP, and yet they're not representative of their communities. They tend to be older, whiter, wealthier, more likely to own homes and cars. The charter could require community boards to be more representative of their communities, or reimagine them entirely through random selection citizen assembly processes, or just other innovative ways of getting community input.
Thank you so much. All right, well, can we, I think what we'll do is have them both speak and then maybe open up to questions for the panel, be more efficient. Thank you, Commissioner. Please continue.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Roman. I'm a homeowner and I've been in my home over 60 years. As developers, excuse me while I look at my phone. Okay, as developers build their properties, they are required to avoid damaging neighboring buildings. This has always been a challenge, especially in New York City, where construction often causes serious harm to adjoining properties. To prevent this, it's required that developers enter into a license agreement with neighboring property owners, granting access to protect those properties. Yet, despite the extensive planning that goes into real estate development, this crucial step is often overlooked. I did my due diligence. I researched. I had a neighbor agreement. I notified my insurance company that construction was starting on both sides of my 100-year-old home at the same time. This happened in 2016. Let that sink in. 9 years. For 9 years, my family and I have been unable to fully enjoy our home. Besides myself, my home is empty. No rental income. My family had to move away up to White Plains to find affordable housing. Developers arrived, friendly, agreeable, promising to fix any damage that projects caused. But when the damage happened, suddenly accountability disappeared. The 2024 Charter Revision Commission introduced reforms to improve the capital planning process, prioritizing capital project efficiency. But as we streamline these processes, we must include clear enforceable protections for homeowners. We cannot sacrifice New Yorkers' quality of life in the name of development. Builders must hold accountability when they fail to honor these agreements with their neighbors. It should not be as easy as just forming an LLC and then vanishing when it's time to take responsibility. That's exactly what happened in my case. A recent city report stated, these reforms are essential to making New York City more resilient to extreme weather, and most importantly, to ensure the well-being of our people, quote and unquote. Well, where's my resiliency? The buildings went up, and while my basement continues to get flooded, creating a hazardous mold infestation. This cannot continue. We need real collaboration between builders and homeowners, not just empty promises. I've taken my case to every politician I could find, and all I hear is call my office in the morning, or worse, get a lawyer. Well, I did that, and guess what? Lawyers are expensive. And after exhausting my retirement, my 401k is still not enough. And when I finally go to court, the judge issues adjournment after adjournment. 9 years later, nothing has been done. So I asked, what happened to getting stuff done? I did my part. Now it's time for my city that I love to do its part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much. And please ask everyone to, please save commentary for the testimony. Thank you so much. Before we open up to questions, I want to, Vishnu Reddy and John Wolfling will be speaking next. Do you have any questions for the panelists? And I do just want to express my, I just want to express my, my sorrow that you're going through that experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, if I'm heard you correct, you were talking about community board appointments, correct? Yeah, sorry.
Yes. Mhm.
And thank you for your testimony. I wanted to know, like, what were your ideas in terms of like how do you see that, that can be done in a way that, you feel is
Sure. I mean, there could be questions on the community board application. I've seen some changes in some boroughs around home ownership. So having the proportion of homeowners versus renters be similar to that in the community. You could do that with a number of different potential dimensions, but I think that could be one step toward, obviously it's hard for anyone to show up at any like 6:30 p.m. meeting. So it often selects for people who have more time or more resources to be able to do that. But if it's possible to rethink ways that community boards could truly be more representative of their community and have proportions of lower income folks or renters or people who are personally affected by the housing crisis.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that should be a charter change, or do you think that's the responsibility? Both certainly very thoughtful suggestions, but the responsibility of the appointing authorities, the borough president and the city council member? And shouldn't they be held accountable?
Yeah, well, what is the accountability process if it ends up?
The voting booth.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, with like 7% turnout rates and very low kind of a high opacity of information about things like community board appointments, I think that like that process wouldn't work. So I do think that I'm not an expert on charters, but I do think that some sort of accountability process or mandate could help, folks appoint more representative boards.
Any other questions?
If it's okay, just to follow, I'm sorry, to follow up, I know we got time. But I've seen in certain cases where you have community board appointments that are not necessarily representative of actual community members and don't have real stakes in the community. So my thought is on how, and I like the idea of how the charter could better serve to address that particular thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also just look to other models of what democratic processes look like. Community boards, if you've ever sat through a community board meeting, it can feel very tedious and not necessarily really optimizing for community input and for true participation. So thinking of, I mean, there are, I served on a grand jury here, and that looked like a truly representative slice, at least of citizens in Brooklyn. Whereas, the way community boards look, it looks like people who have a lot of time and interest to sit there and often say no to things. And so, selecting people at random, having kind of a citizens assembly model. I'm not an expert in this either, but there's a wealth of literature on how other countries and cities try to optimize for truly representative participation in democratic processes.
Yeah, I just want to add, it may be worth looking at the Manhattan process under when Gail Brewer was there, and they actually reimagined all the community boards and really looked at these. I'm just saying that because I think there are ways of thinking about that. And I would say too, not one community board is the same as the next community board too. So you could have some boards in Brooklyn that may be more representative than others, but I think I just want to add those.
I will check that out. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you both so much for your testimony. Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Reddy.
Hi, my name is Vishnu Reddy and I live in Sunnyside. I'm here to ask the commission to push for bold reforms to the charter that meet the moment in the face of an intense housing crisis that's decades in the making. I'm so grateful that we passed an important milestone with City of Yes, but we need to keep the momentum going if we want to have any hope of relief for New Yorkers who struggle to live here. We need government to act to get us the housing we need, but it's clearer now more than ever that the processes set forth decades ago are holding us back from solving the crisis. A clear example of how current process keeps shooting ourselves in the foot is with the Just Home project in the Bronx. It's very clear that the city has a dire need for supportive housing, and the Just Home project is a slam dunk in that regard. The process to get Just Home across the finish line has taken years, and we still have no idea if and when it's going to get approved. More than 2 years ago, Bronx CB11 had a hearing about Just Home, where my friends were harassed and faced threats of violence for simply being in favor of the project. More than 1 year ago, Just Home finally made it to the council, but the council has stalled on it because they are not bound to any time constraint. The fact that we still have no clue what's happening with the project after so long is ridiculous. I'd like the Charter Revision Commission to pursue reforms that will help us do better to deliver homes for New Yorkers, and there are some key reforms I think would help. We should consolidate the advisory review phase of any housing project into a single process led by the borough president. The way we currently do advisory reviews is not working, and I'm sick of attending screaming matches in church basements run by unelected people to get an apartment building built. Borough presidents are much more well-resourced and have more experienced staff that can help run these community input processes better, and by consolidating the process, we can avoid needless slowdowns to progress. We should look at consolidating city agencies like DCP and HPD that do a lot of related work so they can more effectively tackle the housing crisis by having a clear and aligned direction. I'm so grateful to the amazing public servants that are working hard to solve this existential problem for our city. And I believe that consolidating efforts around housing under a single agency would help them serve us better, especially with the staffing shortages in the city right now. I'd also love to see affordable housing on public land get a more streamlined process so we can deliver the housing New Yorkers need to stay and thrive in the city. Whenever I go to community board meetings on housing, I hear my neighbors mention the clear need for more affordable housing, and they are completely right. Lastly, I'd like to see reforms that make exclusionary low-growth neighborhoods contribute their fair share when it comes to housing supply. Thank you for tackling such an important issue for our city, and I'm looking forward to voting yes on much-needed reforms on my ballot.
Thank you so much, Mr. Reddy. We'll have Mr. Wolfling, and then we'll open it up for questions. And before you speak, Mr. Wolfling, just so you know, the next speakers will be Hector Robertson and David Gordon. Mr. Wolfling.
Great, thank you. So my name is John Wolfling. Thank you all for your service on this important commission. I'm here to tell you tonight that the ULURP process is broken.
Turn off your microphone.
Thank you. And I can tell you this with confidence because I'm an architect that's been practicing in the city for 30 years. I've also served on my community board, my local community board in Brooklyn. So I've seen this from both sides. I've seen how the process works from both sides. Much of what I've worked on as an architect is affordable housing, and really truly affordable housing that is sponsored by the city, HPD, and many of those projects have gone through the ULURP process, sometimes for disposition of city-owned property, sometimes for rezoning, and sometimes both. So in my experience, this process is broken in two ways. And the first one, which has been spoken to at length today, is about non-strategic planning. So I'm not going to go into that. But what I will talk about, which is where I have a great degree of frustration. The ULURP process, as many or maybe all of you know, is comprised of two components. There's the pre-certification phase, and then there's the post-certification phase. The post-certification phase takes 6 to 7 months, statutory. It's limited to that. The pre-certification phase can take 3 years or more. That is crazy. And what often takes up that time is urban planning comments. It's talk about where the curb cut is located. It's talk about, the environmental assessment. And I truly believe that we need to build more affordable housing. I have 2 projects that have taken over 3 years for just a simple map change. 3 years of that pre-certification process. So one of my proposals, and I know this is controversial, it's been spoken about tonight, how controversial it might be, would be to, if you've got an all affordable housing project that targets neighborhood AMIs and has a significant percentage that is targeting that neighborhood's AMIs and maybe meets some other environmental factors, just change the map. Change the map and move on. Focus on the bigger, more complicated things. These things that my fellow architect Vishan talked about, it made so much sense. Limit it to what's in the neighborhood, but make that project affordable so that gentrification, displacement, those things are all addressed. I've heard many times in the community board that these are like the primary concerns of my neighbors, and I get it. I understand it. They're right. But we can build more housing. We can do it smart. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Reddy or Mr. Wolfling?
I have a question. So, first, if you do it the way you say, right, is there, are you sacrificing quality for speed? I agree with you, by the way, in terms of the ULURP process and the length of time and stuff like that. I totally agree. But I'm just wondering that is there a way that we can do this to speed it up, but without sacrificing even addressing things like infrastructure throughout the local community, community engagement, all those different things. Is there a way to do that without sacrificing those things?
I think this does go back to the comprehensive plan that's been mentioned by many others. You need to look at what those implications are, whether it's, school, sewage, transit. The thing that was so, I think, genius about the study that Vishan spoke about was limiting it to areas that could really handle some of these things. Don't build in flood-prone areas. Build where transit is. That infill with that mid-rise housing, the fact that we can get so much out of that makes so much sense. Thank you for your question.
I have a follow-up question. So how would environmental review play? What role would environmental review play in the process you described?
So it may be something as simple as looking at shadows. Maybe it is, making sure that the density of this is not going to outweigh something that's also in the neighborhood. One of the things that I often do in my rezoning proposals is I look at the context around. I'll look at what the adjacent zoning districts are. I'll look at whether there's a big building right next door or within a block radius or within a relatively close area. I think in Miami, there is something very similar. If you are matching the density of something that's in a mile radius, you get a much faster process to get that project approved. So that would be one way to do it.
As someone who's built affordable housing, have all the housing that you've built that's been affordable, has it been to the AMI of that local community?
It has been. We often, like every unit is affordable. And it's not just like the 130 AMI affordable, it's 20, 40, there's some 60 and some 80, maybe some 100 that offset that lower rent. And I think one of the controversial things about doing these all affordable housing projects is that it takes a lot of city subsidy to do those. If you do have a more mixed income, like an 80-20 using the 421A or the 485W or 485X program, those two populations can cross-subsidize each other. I think that actually is better housing policy to have a mix of incomes within buildings and within communities. It allows people to stay in place. It allows for more resiliency in a building's pro forma. If there is some sort of problem where people can't pay rent for whatever reason, there's more ability for those buildings to survive those types of situations.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Hector Robinson and David Gordon. And just so you know, up next would be Cormac Sladbird and Michael Abrahams. Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
I think there's been a lot of talk about comprehensive planning in this meeting tonight. But I think that a lot of people need to realize that comprehensive planning is more than just land use. We have to start focusing on education, transportation, public health, and safety, sustainability. Most of the buildings that are built, for example, in my community in Crown Heights, are not taking these aspects into account. There's a lot of luxury buildings where the population of Crown Heights is probably less than $65,000 a year. And so when we take this comprehensive planning and not take into account all of these different aspects that goes into building a community, I think that we've been absolutely short-sighted. We do not want to stifle the development of New York City. That's not the goal. And as I sit on a community board and I see exactly what's happening in the community and how developers come into our community and don't take into account the community residents' will and desires of what exactly they need for their communities. And so when the city council and the borough president actually think that having a comprehensive planning is going to solve all of the problems and cutting out the community, I just think, simply think that this is just not the way we should go. I don't necessarily think that the commission really has a lot of say in exactly how we should actually handle development in different communities. But I think the ULIP process should remain. It gives communities a voice in exactly what they need to build in their communities. And it actually tells the developers exactly how they need to build in their communities. And so absence of this is absolutely necessary for us to continue doing in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this hearing. I'm here today to testify as an advocate for more housing, more homes in New York. I'm a Lower East Side renter, and I frequently find myself at CB3 meetings and other public meetings, much like tonight's. Frankly, tonight's meeting feels much more productive than the average CB land use meeting. I want to emphasize my support for two specific planks proposed tonight by our esteemed experts. First, a fast track for ULURP as proposed by Vicky Bean, as well as Anne Marie Gray of Open New York. And secondly, strengthening the interagency organization. I think as Vicky Bean testified, and this was one of the largest contributors of added time, and I don't think it's the type of time that people would object to taking out of the process. It's the type of time that if we can get our agencies more coordinated, it can be a seamless win-win for everybody. But I won't go on too much longer because I'm proud to be testifying in favor of these reforms as I wrote my senior thesis on this exact topic, much of it based on the research and work of experts who testified today, including Vicky Bean and Vishan Chakrabarti. So I'm here to ask this commission to lean on their expertise and lean on the expertise heard here tonight. You invited these experts for a reason, and they have done the work and know what is needed to be done in order to reform the commission, in order to reform ULURP. I also would just like remind everybody that the commission's work product at the end of the day will be a referendum that everyday voters will get to vote on. Those voters include myself and the other everyday public New Yorkers who have come here to testify. And so in that vein, I really hope that you use the expertise to its greatest advantage and put forward what they think is best for New Yorkers, and we'll have the opportunity to accept or reject that. So I'll end my testimony by saying that I look forward to voting in favor of some of the reforms that I've heard here tonight, and I hope the commission includes them in their final proposal. And I look forward to voting for these because I think that they will bring about lower rents, and it will mean less time for me spending less time in lengthy meetings begging for more housing and cheaper rents all the time. I think that we can save all of our times with this process. So thank you again, and I'll cut it off there.
Thank you so much. Any questions for our panelists?
So, thank you for your testimony, both of you. I wanted to know, are you are you okay with streamlining the ULURP process? Or do you think that the ULURP process is good as it is? And if you had any particular recommendations, what would that be? Whether to make it better or keep it the same or whatever the case is?
Well, I think the process should be streamlined. I think that we spend a lot of time in community board trying to make sure that the community is protected from, unnecessary tall buildings and developments that don't really help the community. So I don't necessarily think that the process need to be revamped or taken offline. Yes, we need to have a fast track to make sure that whatever is built in the community, number one, is useful for the community. And number two, that the community continues to have a voice as to whether or not that usefulness is what is good for the people of the community, not necessarily for the developer. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I just want to note, our ASL interpreters are only scheduled to stay here till 8 p.m. And I want to see if I want to know if anyone here requires ASL service who's still in the room, because we can ask them to stay later, but we'll only do so if someone needs interpretation. There are subtitles online, but for people in the room. Okay. Okay, all right, thank you so much. So our next speakers are Cormac Sladbird and Michael Abrams. I'm sure I butchered both those names, so I apologize. Afterwards will be Daniel Goliher and Julio Pena. Thank you so much, Mr. Bird. I'm sorry. Can you, what's how you pronounce your name? I'm sorry.
Slade Bird.
I'm not even close. Slade Bird. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Cormac Slade Bird. I urge this commission to take bold action to reform the charter for a more prosperous New York City. For decades, our city has been mired in a housing emergency, a crisis declared year after year with little to no real change. For over 50 years, we have simply hoped that the emergency would fix itself, but housing remains as unaffordable as ever. This failure exposes our inability to address the root cause: insufficient new housing supply. There are two proposals that can help break this cycle. To help contextualize these proposals a little bit, they're working on the member deference problem that Howard Slatkin eloquently brought up earlier today. First, we must reform the City Council's role in land use decisions during a housing emergency. Today, the Council can block or dilute new housing proposals with a simple majority vote, repeatedly stifling projects essential to increasing our housing stock. What if instead, during a declared emergency, the Council power to disapprove land use decisions be raised to a supermajority threshold? This change to Section 197D would force the Council to take its own emergency declaration seriously, ensuring that only proposals with near unanimous opposition can be blocked. Second, we need to reshape the Council's composition so that it represents the entire city rather than narrow local interests. With 51 district-based members, our current Council is often paralyzed by parochial pressures. Let's add 10 citywide at-large seats to Chapter 2 of the Charter. This would inject a broader perspective into the legislative process. These representatives, accountable to all New Yorkers, would focus on metropolitan-wide issues and help counterbalance localized resistance to progress. Consider the transformative potential of these reforms. In the early 1900s, New York built over 700,000 new housing units in less than a decade, a construction boom that stabilized rents, created vibrant, diverse neighborhoods. This historical example shows that bold, supply-driven policies can reshape a city's housing market. As a great New York City politician once declared, far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, or even though checkered by failure. This spirit of daring innovation has been lacking here in New York City. While the recently passed City of Yes was a step in the right direction, it was significantly watered down and pales in comparison to what we could be doing. Just this week, Cambridge, Massachusetts passed zoning reforms which eliminated outdated single-family restrictions and now allows 6-story buildings to be built citywide. It is now more restrictive to build in Brooklyn than it is in Cambridge, a disparity that must change. In summary, these two reforms work in tandem to break the cycle of inaction that has defined New York City's housing policy for far too long. By imposing a supermajority requirement for blocking new housing during an emergency, and by expanding the council to include citywide voices, we can set up New York on a path toward real rapid change. Thank you to Chair Berry and the Charter Revision Commission.
Thank you so much. And please, when I ask people in the audience to please allow folks to testify so we can hear them. Mr. Abrahams.
Hey, so I don't have quite as much of a prepared talk. I wanted to voice my support for the Open New York's like revision recommendations, particularly one that would create like a fast track for fair housing based on like Speaker Adams' like framework. Like basically, you know, there's been a lot said about how you know, our housing shortage, like lack of supply, like increase has been like causing this. But like, you know, I think one thing that a lot of people who have been like suggesting things have been like, oh, let's add complications to the process. Let's like add the city, like, you know, comprehensive plan, like, you know, and like, yes, like I understand that, but I just want to like ask that we all like try to consider like a principle of like designing rules that like a rules-based system, something that can like simplify, streamline. Like if we were to create a like comprehensive plan, right? Like the value of that would be in creating something that we agree to, like simple agreement that like we can later like revise and say, hey, like that's what we agreed to. Like we don't have to go through these complicated processes, and it like speeds things up, right? So you know, I guess I also wanted to maybe just address a little bit of this like you know, what is a community in New York? Like, you know, oh, you're a gentrifier, right? Like hearing from the back, like you know, it's like, you know, I've been living here for 8 years, right? Like I'm a renter, you know, and like, you know, my friends are here. I've lived here. I've been coming to New York, and like this is my home, right? Like, and you know, like I think that like the ordinary
Please, if you can please, I mean, we were all respectful, everybody else has to.
yeah, like ordinary or ordinary renters are just trying to survive here. Like, you know, we just want like prices to like come down, like that, you know, we just want to be able to live here. And so like, you know, I just want to like, you know, ask that like, you know, you know, or, you know, allowing people to build housing for like, you know, people who want to live here, like that is New York. Like we are New Yorkers too. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Any questions for the panelists? Commissioner Lemont?
Thank you. I just had a question about your proposal to require supermajorities of the city council, because it's not clear to me how that would change any of the dynamics that we have today. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, we all know that most things get decided in committee and then just get voted through in a large package together. I mean, the hope is that that combined with perhaps the citywide at-large members, if all 10 of them were in favor of all new construction, that is already almost close to the required 25, you know, the required 25%. I mean, I think there's not a great answer to that. You could have a supermajority that requires 80%. You could have a supermajority that requires 85%. You know, I don't, you know, have the right numbers, but you understand.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
I had a quick question, and it's just, I wanted to learn something from you. You referred to the 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I caught that right. So my question to you is, do you think it's that we should look back to that time period or even before, right before that? Or should we just try and do something different? When I think of the 1900s, or I think before that, I think of places like, you know, when policies allow for communities like Seneca Village to turn into Central Park. Okay. So I'm, my thing is really like, I kind of look at these things like look at all of the stuff that has been here that we have been doing, and what do we do? I want to know from you, like, what do you think? Like, how do you think that we really should like just draw upon the past, or should we just look at everything and try to do something new?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be learned from the past. I think a very poignant example that I was considering here was we had at-large members, they were borough-based at-large members as recently as 1984, which was, of course, before the Board of Estimates. But, you know, this is a thing that has existed before, right? We've had borough at-large members. Those were struck down because they were not equal votes because the boroughs had different populations. But say, citywide at-large members, those would be equal representatives. So there is certainly precedent for many of these bold options that we could, take our modern context and, use what we've done before as a way to think about what could be done moving forward.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Next up, we have Daniel Golaher and Julio Pena. And again, I'm really going to ask everyone if we could please be respectful for each other. It's very difficult to get through and hear all the information. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank you. Continue. Please do. Yes.
My name is Daniel Gollier. I'm the founder of the Civic School Maximum New York, and my students include city and state employees, as well as a wide cross-section of New York City. I've submitted my full testimony electronically, which includes 5 broad recommendations, but I want to highlight one recommendation for the commission today, which is actually something that Cormac already mentioned. Section 197D of the charter covers city council review of land use decisions rendered by the City Planning Commission. I recommend amending this section to reflect the reality of the housing shortage, which means, among other things, while the council has declared a legal housing emergency, it shall have limited authority to disapprove of new housing supply only. If the city really is in a housing emergency, as the council has dutifully declared in our administrative code for at least 50 years, I believe the charter should hold them, by mandated procedure, to their word. City and state law acknowledge that the emergency is created by a severe shortage of housing supply, particularly private residential construction, and the charter should facilitate rapid supply of this nature. To that end, during a council-declared housing emergency, I think Section 197D could say the following with regard to any decision that proposes new housing supply. 1. The council shall only disapprove a decision with a 3/4 vote of all council members, otherwise the decision will be considered approved by default. 2, the council may approve a decision with modification with a majority vote of all council members if those modifications do not decrease estimated housing unit production. While the city council will likely not be pleased by these amendments, to put it mildly, they are appropriate given 2 things. 1, the council's own declaration of an emergency for the past 5 decades, and 2, the lack of major action to solve the same emergency. These changes would also provide the council with an incentive to get us out of the supply-induced emergency so that they could reclaim broader land use approval authority. These changes would structurally alter discretionary housing proposals from the current default no that must be argued to a yes, which privileges member deference already discussed, to a default yes that must be argued to a no. This places the argumentative burden correctly given our housing crisis. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Golaher? No, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think Mr. Pena is not here. All right, next up we have Jillian Morris and Stephen Krim. You're on. Yeah,
Can you
you're
hear
on
me?
now.
Okay, hi. My name's Stephen Krim. It's getting late and I'll be really brief. I'm a Manhattan resident and I'm excited that this review commission is working on housing and land use. I want to call attention to some of the proposals you've heard about reforming or improving the Landmarks Preservation Commission and historic preservation more generally. I support some of the proposals that you've heard about expanding what should be considered in the landmarking process. I value the place of historic buildings in our city, but I strongly believe it needs to be balanced against the needs to provide more housing and just opportunity for change over time. I happen to live in a part of Manhattan that has a lot of historic districts, and while it's very pretty, I often walk around thinking, I hope those don't get bigger. Because I think that means that we're going to, it to me means a decrease in the opportunity for growth and change. I think the suggestion simply of changing what can be considered could be potentially powerful, because then, at least on the record, there's some sort of consideration of the implications of landmarking and historic preservation rules on housing affordability and supply. Perhaps like some more specific ideas could be some sort of cumulative effects style analysis that's like, well, in this area, we already have this much of the land or land use or housing stock under landmark. So, we have to make a much, there's a higher bar to allow further landmarking or restriction on adjacent properties, or perhaps some sort of an idea that's like, well, if you're going to put this much more housing under some sort of regulation, then an equivalent amount needs to be taken out or something like that. Specific recommendations like that are beyond what I can offer right now, but I just want to say that I know a lot of the attention will be around ULURP, but, and I think that's very important, but I do think that there's some really positive, perhaps easier reforms possible through landmarking and historic preservation. Thanks.
I think it's very helpful. Thank you. Any questions? We have one question for you, Commissioner Lamar.
I thank you very much for that. When we did Soho NoHo rezoning, we knew that, the challenge of creating new units in historic districts was really going to be an issue. And so I absolutely welcome thinking about ways in which that process can take into account the impact that it has on housing. And so I would just encourage any ideas you have in that regard to be shared with us, because I also agree that that's probably lower hanging fruit than some of the other things that we've talked about, but actually would be meaningful.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. We're going to move to virtual testimony. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. Press a button. Thank you so much.
My name is Jillian Morris. I was born in New York City and moved away as a child because my parents couldn't afford to live here. I've recently been able to move back. I'm an entrepreneur. I founded a technology company, and I'm a renter now in Fort Greene. I, like everyone here, have witnessed the housing crisis. We know that we have less than 1.4% vacancy. I lived in San Francisco for a while, and I am slightly ashamed that San Francisco, which is known for being NIMBY and anti-housing and anti-development, has actually built more housing per capita in the last 10 years than New York City has. And I personally think New York City is a much better city than San Francisco on nearly every level, but this is something where I think we could do a lot better. We've heard a lot of great ideas here tonight. I do think, as many others have said, ULURP can be reformed. It could be faster, more representative of the city's best interests, rather than those of the broadly older, wealthier, whiter community board members that have undue representation in the process and undue sway. There is also a lot of needless extra bureaucracy in new building. The Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Department of City Planning have a ton of overlap, and there could be charter reform that combines a lot of those departments. Oversight is also split between the Department of Buildings, the Fire Department, Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I'm sure there could be a lot of streamlining there as well. I'm not an expert in these matters. Many more well-informed people have testified, and I just want to add my small voice to the urgent need to pay attention to these matters and address our affordability crisis so that more people like me could actually grow up in New York City, and more people can move here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Ms. Morris? No? Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Okay. I believe now we're going to move on to virtual testimony, beginning with Michelle De La Uz. No? Okay, thank you. Well, hopefully Michelle will submit her testimony in writing. Next, we have Sue-Wen Chong. Okay. Frank Morano. No. All right. Jay Sorid. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thor. Please continue.
Yes, how long do I have in terms of time?
3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jay Sword. I'm a former member of the Community Board 9 Land Use Committee, a former member of the Community Board 17 Land Use Committee, and I volunteered for community boards and for different committees. If the Charter Revision Commission, which is basically discussing whether or not to put ULURP on the chopping block, what you should all do is you should have people from the land use committees of community boards as part of the Charter Revision Commission. The Charter Revision Commission, for instance, when you deal with Brooklyn, you should have had 18 members on the Charter Revision Commission as the heads of the ULURP committees from the various community boards so they can give input as to how they would be affected. That's point number one. Point number two is if you want to change things and make it more democratic and more progressive in a city and be, have all the integrity and all of the lofty ideas that everybody is talking about, there should be direct election of community board members. That's so nice. I got to say it twice. There should be direct election of community board members instead of them being appointed as political cronies who are simply loyal to the hand that feeds them. That's the problem. So if you have 40 census tract districts in Community Board 9, you could simply have elections for the 40 different census tract districts, and you get 40 members, and then you have 10 more spots, which could be at large, and then you fill up the 50 spots. There should be direct election of the community board members. What's going on is the local communities are losing control. You're getting rid of the local voices of the local community, and you're basically making this a city decision over local matters, which nobody wants, which is hardly progressive. I've heard a whole bunch of people add in the racial elements and to say that, oh, these community boards are too white or they have older white people. You come into a place like Community Board 9, and you will see many people who would join the community board. Matter of fact, the majority of the community board is African American, yet they vote against a lot of the different proposals. So the community board does not want to give up power. In the city of Yes, I think the majority of the community boards, almost all the community boards, which were Black and brown, voted down the city of Yes. So it is working. And I think that it's very elitist that the charter revision should say that we're going to get rid of local control and it's going to be up to the city. Because there's a tremendous amount of displacement that happens as a result of decisions made.
Thank you so much.
On the city.
I'm sorry, Mr. Thor, we're at time. I apologize. Any questions for Mr. Thor? All right, thank you so much for your testimony. We appreciate it. Next, I'm going to call on Olivia Gonzalez Killingsworth. Is Ms. Killingsworth there? Okay, great.
Yeah, hi. Hey, thanks for hearing from me. I'm calling in as a member of the Brooklyn community. Actually away right now. I'm out of the country, but this matters to me so much. I'll take a break from my vacation to call y'all. And just speak in support of a lot of the different proposals that have come before you tonight in favor of fast tracking affordable housing and other types of mixed income and subsidized housing that meets the fair housing framework and other community goals for affordable housing. I'm saying that as someone who is a former resident of 100% affordable subsidized housing. I used to live at the Skirmerhorn in downtown Brooklyn, breaking ground property. And I qualified for that because I'm a low-income artist, or I was a low-income artist. I've been a professional actor for over 20 years, and half my neighbors were also low-income artists. The other half were formerly homeless individuals. So I'm very happy to see my friend Shams on the panel tonight, and I'm glad that you're a part of this discussion. Time is money in housing development. The building that I lived in It took a long, long time for it to be approved and built and shovels in the ground. So in housing advocacy, we say housing delayed is housing denied. So anything that this revision commission can do to consider fast tracking the process for the approval of housing that is 100% affordable or mixed income subsidized, that can make our subsidy dollars go further and create more housing for early career and emerging artists like myself. I mean, at the time I was early career. And then just lastly, as a union member for 20 years, I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA and Actors Equity Association. I want to just boost all of the other union members who've come before you tonight. I think it really is important to include them in these discussions. They do the work, they build the housing, they're the experts. So I think we have to keep affordability and speed in mind, but I also think that union members deserve a place at the table, just as formerly homeless New Yorkers do, just as members of the community do, the broader community. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Any questions for Ms. Killingsworth? Okay. Next, testifying virtually is Vadim Grayboys, who will be followed by Chloe Fitoussi. Welcome, Mr. Grayboys.
I looked at Kid or South America in 1989 with my mom as a refugee from the Soviet Union. We were part of a flood of Soviet refugees at that time, and we mostly settled in New York. Back then, bedroom apartment in Crown, and the rent was only $130 a month, easily affordable on welfare. I've recently returned to my old neighborhood, but this time I'm paying $2,000 a month to share a two-bedroom apartment. Recently, New York experienced another flood of refugees, but this time we did not have nearly enough housing to house them. Because of the acute housing shortage, we spent billions of dollars housing refugees, forcing cutbacks in other city services, making the immigration a crisis, turning the public against immigration and refugees, and propelling Donald Trump back into the White House. We've talked about how the actions of community boards and city council members protecting their local interests have negative effects on the overall city. But not only that, but by negatively affecting New York as the largest and most important city in America, local interests can negatively affect the entire country. That we were unable to handle a flood of refugees without adversely affecting other city residents is shameful. I'm ashamed for this city. We should all be ashamed. This is a city with the Statue of Liberty. Have we forgotten what the Statue of Liberty represents? We've always been able to accept large floods of immigrants and integrate them into our city until very recently. The reason the influx of refugees caused a crisis is that there's a massive shortage of homes. We need to significantly reform the charter with a focus on building as many homes as possible across our city, that it doesn't happen again. I support all the pro-housing reforms discussed by this commission during this meeting, but I also believe that they do not go. I hope that one day I'll see New York City accepting waves of refugees again, as we've always done so, except for a few shameful decades in recent history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Appreciate it. Next, we have Ms. Fitoussi. Ms. Fitoussi.
Hi. My name is Chloe Fitoussi. I'm a native New Yorker and a mother of two. I am here because unaffordable housing doesn't just mean unaffordable housing. As we all know, it means that everything else becomes unaffordable too, from coffee to childcare, as I know too well. I'm heartened by tonight's consensus that ULURP should be reformed, and I support Anne Marie's recommendation to streamline the process, accepting community inputs, but doing so more quickly, ultimately bringing down costs. I also want to second earlier testimony. Voters will vote on these reforms. Let's bring them some bold thinking, from randomized recruiting to reforming city agencies, and allow the democratic process to show us what the city wants. Incremental changes are not going to suffice, and I urge you to meet the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I believe we have Teresa Westerdahl in the room to testify. Thank you.
Hi.
Yes, can you press the button on the microphone?
You might want to turn that one on. Hi, my name is Teresa Westerdahl. I live in Crown Heights, near Ebbetsfield, Empire Boulevard, where we have an incredible amount of development. I do serve on Community Board 9 on the URLIP committee, by the way, but I'm here just to talk for myself. But I have been going to meetings and listening to my neighbors for a decade that I've lived there. But with all of this development and all this building going up, we have worked to protect our green spaces. The city hasn't protected us. The city council hasn't protected us. Our community members have had to sue to protect our green spaces. I find that appalling. Right now, there's a development in process from an Empire that's going to probably shade, if it goes through, it's going to shade Jackie Robinson School, not just the ball courts, the school, the garden, the playground. It's the development that's happening there now. Our city agencies are not looking out for us. I've been in touch with the city council and my community board because we've had a water main break, a street collapse. They did not do proper remediation for the development. This is development that's in the old Firestone building on the corner of Sullivan, Bedford, and Empire Boulevard. So we're dealing with an environmental crisis. A water main broke. It took the city 3 weeks to fix it. And this is going to continue. We're not being protected. And I don't think deference should go to city council to Reynoso, our borough president, or the city. I think it should be kept within the community boards because we're best able to identify what's happening in our board. And we want to protect our resources and we want to keep people safe that are already living there and not, the amount of people that are having to leave my community is astounding. None of those places are for them. It's all going to be luxury housing. There's very, very little affordable housing being built, and it's sad. And there's not really a housing crisis. There's plenty of housing. There's plenty of apartment buildings if you have $4,000 or $5,000, right? It's there. There's thousands of units. I've been looking for a friend. Thousands of units are out there. Over 5,000 in Brooklyn right now, if you can pay that much. But nobody should have to pay that much. We need some help, and this isn't it. Changing this isn't going to help anybody. It's going to help tech bros. Our city's being taken over by technology.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thank you
Okay,
so much for your testimony.
any questions?
Appreciate it. No?
Oh, I didn't think so.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it. We have testimony from Nicola Cox remotely.
Good afternoon, good evening. I feel like I'm tag teaming with Teresa Westerdahl, who is actually a neighbor of mine. And I appreciate her voice and many of the other voices that we've heard tonight representing the community and the people that have been longtime residents. As Teresa mentioned, I live in Crown Heights South. We're near Prospect Park and Ebbetsfield. And my blocks are comprised primarily of 1 and 2 family houses, but we're zoned R6. So even as of right development, especially with the City of Yes, changes that have taken place recently can be detrimental to the 100-year-old houses that we have. As a woman spoke about earlier, it's important that the people that are in the community are considered when we're making these changes. I know fast tracking is important, but keep in mind the people that are here and have to live with the changes that will be proposed. There have been talk about fast tracking developments where you look at the highest building in a community and make sure that if a proposed development is lower than that building, then you're going to fast track it. The highest building in our community would be Ebbets Field and Tivoli Towers, which were always considered out of context. But they were part of Ebbets Field when Ebbets Field was, when the Dodgers moved, this apartment building was built in the 70s. We still had primarily a low-rise community here, but every development that comes along, they look to Ebbets Field as being contextual. And now we have, again, as Teresa mentioned, development all along Prospect Park and the Botanic Gardens being proposed. So again, my main thing is to look at the Black and Brown communities that have done our fair share through the past few years. I want to make sure that we continue to be protected because we've been the ones that have survived redlining, survived high crime rates. These are people that have lived in this community for 60 years, 50 years. And now because we're now desirable, the rates are going up, development is increasing, and now these residential renters as well as homeowners are being pushed out. And it's not fair to us, it's not fair to the diversity and the liveliness of this city. And I want to make sure that our voices continue to be heard. It's critical that the community boards that have been protecting these communities over the years continue to have a vital role in this project. It can't just be top down. You have to be able to have people with the feet on the ground, ears to the street that understand the community and know where deeply affordable housing can be built in this community, in this city, because that's truly what's needed, not just market rate housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cox. Any questions for Ms. Cox?
So the one thing that I'm struggling to understand is, if every community board can, and I'm really want to learn, if every community board is able to reject housing for whatever reasons, whether it's too tall or whatever, the question is that what happens when we try to spread development to places that where there is not the fair share? Like, how do we address that part?
Well, I think it's key to, as I think someone talked about earlier, creating a framework, criteria, and basically a checklist. What has this community contributed to the city goals? Again, Borough President Reynoso spoke about the fact that we have to look at it from a citywide lens, which I agree, citywide, borough, etc. We don't want to just have a tunnel vision and only look at what's happening in our specific community. At the same time, we need to balance. And so we need to make sure that we do have those people that can speak to the city. How is it going to impact our community? And if we haven't contributed any housing at all in the last 10 years, and you're only asking for two additional stories, then that's a big difference than telling someone who's in a 2-story building that I'm going to put a 14-story building in your backyard. And your community has already contributed several thousand units of housing. So I think that if you have some kind of a criteria where you can check off and understand what has that community contributed, what is the impact to the surrounding buildings, what is already in the pipeline for that community, that can make a big difference in your decision-making process.
Thank you
Thank you
for
so
that. I
much.
appreciate that.
Thank you. Any other questions, Ms. Cox? All right, I want to thank everyone for testifying, especially those of you who've held out with us for the evening. Appreciate it. Remind everybody who's still listening, you can submit testimony to charter testimony at citycharter.nyc.gov. And our next public hearing will be in Queens on February 24th at 5 p.m. at the New York City Department of Design and Construction at 3030 Thompson Avenue. Enter on 30th Place in the first floor multipurpose room. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting. Any discussion? All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you so much.